"Let her go. We will not pay for the surgery." Those were the exact words my father told the doctor while I lay trapped in a medically induced coma. He actually signed a do not resuscitate order just to save some money for his golden child. When I finally forced my eyes open, I did not scream. I did not cry. I did something much worse that left his entire empire bankrupt in exactly 48 hours. If you have ever been treated like a burden by the people who were supposed to protect you, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe to see how I dismantled their perfect world piece by piece. I am Iman, 35 years old. Until that fateful Tuesday, I thought I knew exactly where I stood in my family. The coldness was nothing new. Growing up in a sprawling estate in Buckhead, Atlanta, my parents Reginald and Vivian built a logistics empire and a pristine social reputation. They expected perfection, prestige, and unwavering obedience. I chose my own path away from their suffocating control. I survived a brutal car accident that should have killed me. My body was shattered, my spine severely traumatized, and the doctors placed me in a medically induced coma to stabilize my vital signs. What nobody realized was that the medication paralyzing my muscles did not turn off my hearing. I was trapped in a heavy, dark void. I could not move a single finger. I could not open my eyes or speak, but my mind was wide awake. I could hear the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor next to my bed. I could hear the soft squeak of rubber shoes on the sterile hospital floor. And then, I heard the heavy, deliberate footsteps of my father entering the intensive care unit. He was not alone. The crisp, sharp click of my mother Vivian's designer heels followed right behind him. I waited in the darkness of my own mind, desperate for a comforting word, a warm hand on mine, or even a simple prayer. Instead, the first sound that broke the clinical silence was the sharp scratch of a pen moving aggressively across a paper clipboard. Dr. Elias spoke first, his voice tight with professional restraint but underlying urgency. "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, you need to understand the gravity of this situation. Iman has severe spinal trauma. The standard procedures are not enough to guarantee she will ever walk again, let alone recover fully. There is a specialized surgical intervention we can perform right now. It has an incredible success rate." I felt a surge of hope, a surgery, a way out of this broken body. "But it is highly experimental and out of network." Dr. Elias continued, "Your insurance will not cover it. The out-of-pocket cost is $250,000. We need your authorization and payment clearance immediately to prep the operating room." The silence that followed was so absolute it felt heavy. I waited for my father to say yes. $250,000 was pocket change for Reginald Sterling. He spent more than that on his vintage car collection just last year. "Let her go," Reginald said. His voice was completely flat. No hesitation, no sorrow. Just the cold, calculating tone he used when terminating an underperforming contract. Dr. Elias sounded genuinely stunned. "I beg your pardon. Sir, we are talking about your daughter. Her life and mobility are on the line." "I am talking about a financial reality," Reginald replied, the scratch of the pen echoing again. "I am signing the do not resuscitate order. Do whatever the basic insurance covers. If her body gives out, you do not intervene. We are not paying for this." My heart monitor must have spiked because the machine began beeping faster, but trapped in my chemical prison, I could not scream. My own father was signing my death warrant to save a fraction of his wealth. That is when my mother Vivian chimed in. Her voice was perfectly manicured, hushed but firm, completely devoid of maternal grief. "We simply cannot liquidate the company assets for this right now, Reginald. Jasmine and Trent need that $500,000 wire transfer cleared by tomorrow morning." Jasmine, my younger sister, the beautiful, compliant golden child who had never heard the word no in her entire 28 years of life, and Trent, her entitled white husband who spoke over everyone at Thanksgiving and constantly pitched empty business ideas. Vivian continued, her tone dripping with quiet resentment toward me. "Trent's tech startup is at a critical phase. His investors are waiting." Iman chose her path when she walked away from the family firm. She chose to be some low-level desk clerk in the city instead of taking her rightful place in our empire. She made her bed. We must protect the family legacy. The logistics company needs that capital, and Trent is going to elevate our status in Silicon Valley. The betrayal cut deeper than my physical injuries. They were sacrificing my life, my actual heartbeat, to fund a scam tech startup for their white son-in-law. They cared more about buying their way into Trent's proximity to prestige than they cared about their own flesh and blood. They believed I was just a lowly clerk, a failure who crunched numbers for a modest salary simply because I never bragged about my promotions or my wealth. I kept my life private to avoid their constant demands and financial scrutiny. They mistook my silence for failure. Dr. Elias pushed back, his voice rising in disgust. I have never seen a family prioritize a business wire transfer over a specialized life-saving procedure. You are effectively leaving her to deteriorate. I do not throw good money into a sinking ship, Reginald stated coldly. Keep her comfortable, doctor. We have to go. We are already late for the alumni gala. The mayor is expecting us at our table. The sharp click of Vivian's heels turned toward the door. They were leaving me to die so they would not miss a high society networking event. The heavy door to the intensive care unit clicked shut. The silence rushed back in, but my mind was roaring. A sinking ship, a low-level desk clerk. Adrenaline, pure and fiery, surged through my veins, fighting against the heavy sedatives holding me down. The darkness in my mind cracked. I focused every ounce of willpower I possessed into my eyelids. It felt like lifting cinder blocks, but I forced them open. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room blinded me for a second. I was alone, strapped to machines, broken and bruised. But I was not a sinking ship, and I certainly was not a low-level desk clerk. I was a senior partner at Vanguard Financial. I was the exact private equity executive holding the massive, over-leveraged debt of Reginald's supposedly wealthy logistics empire. My parents had been playing a dangerous game of financial smoke and mirrors for years, bleeding their own company dry to maintain their elite Atlanta lifestyle and to fund Trent's endless delusions. I knew their books better than they did. My hand twitched. The pain was excruciating, a blinding white heat shooting up my spine, but I dragged my fingers across the pristine white sheets until I found the emergency call button. I pressed it down and held it. Within seconds, the door flew open and Dr. Elias rushed in, his eyes widening in absolute shock as he saw me staring back at him. "You are awake," he breathed out, rushing to check the monitors. "This is impossible, the sedatives." My throat felt like crushed glass. It took all my strength to form a single raspy sentence. "My bag. Get my bag." He hesitated, looking at my vital signs, but the absolute command in my eyes made him stop. He moved to the small plastic bin in the corner where the paramedics had deposited my personal effects. He pulled out my black leather purse and brought it to the bed. My fingers trembled as I unzipped the side pocket. I bypassed the standard credit cards and pulled out a solid, heavy piece of metal. An exclusive obsidian titanium black card. The kind of card that did not have a limit. I pushed it into Dr. Elias's hand. "Charge the $250,000, I rasped. "Prep the operating room, now." He stared at the heavy metal card, then up at me, realization dawning on his face. He nodded firmly, his professional demeanor snapping back into place, and bolted out the door to alert the surgical team. While the nurses scrambled in the hallway outside, I reached back into my bag and pulled out my personal phone. The screen cast a harsh glow on my face. Every movement sent fire through my nerves, but the cold fury anchoring my heart kept me focused. I opened my encrypted firm application and dialed the direct line to my offshore banking division. The line clicked open immediately. Vanguard Financial Executive Division. "This is Amon Sterling," I whispered into the receiver. "Authorization code Delta 79er. Identity verified, Miss Sterling. How can we assist you tonight?" I stared at the ceiling, thinking of my father signing away my life so he could hand $500,000 to a con artist. "Freeze all outgoing transfers for Reginald Sterling's corporate and personal accounts," I commanded. "Lock them down entirely. Activate the distress clause on his corporate debt." "Understood," the voice replied smoothly. "The freeze is active immediately." I dropped the phone onto the mattress as the surgical team rushed into the room to wheel me away. My father thought he was protecting his legacy by letting me go. He had no idea he had just handed me the keys to his complete destruction. My thumb pressed down on the red plastic button with every ounce of strength I had left in my shattered body. The harsh buzzing of the emergency alarm instantly shattered the quiet of the intensive care unit. Footsteps slapped against the linoleum hallway, growing louder and more frantic. The heavy door swung open, hitting the wall with a loud thud. Dr. Elias stood frozen in the doorway. His medical chart slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. He stared at me as if he were looking at a ghost. "You are awake!" he breathed out, rushing to the side of my bed. His hands hovered over the monitors, checking the erratic spikes in my heart rate. "Iman, do not try to move. You are completely fighting the sedatives. This is medically impossible." My throat felt like it was lined with crushed glass. The breathing tube had left my vocal cords raw, but the burning anger radiating through my veins gave me a voice. "My bag!" I rasped the sound barely more than a harsh whisper. "Get my bag right now." He hesitated, looking at my vital signs clearly torn between his medical training and the absolute command in my eyes. He tried to place a calming hand on my shoulder. "You need to rest. Your father just signed the paperwork refusing the spinal surgery. I am so sorry, Iman, but the hospital administration will not allow us to prep the operating room without authorized payment. The procedure is $250,000 out of pocket." I did not blink. I did not shed a single tear. I just stared at him with a cold, unwavering intensity. I said, "Get my bag." Dr. Elias stepped back, thoroughly unnerved by my complete lack of panic. He moved to the small plastic bin in the corner of the room where the paramedics had deposited my personal effects after the car accident. He pulled out my black leather purse stained with dust from the crash and brought it to the mattress. My fingers trembled as I unzipped the side pocket. Every movement sent blinding waves of agony up my spine, a terrifying reminder that if I did not get this surgery, I would be paralyzed for the rest of my life. My parents knew that risk. They simply did not care. They had placed a price tag on my mobility and decided it was too high to interfere with funding my younger sister Jasmine's entitled white husband. I bypassed the standard debit cards and pulled out a solid, heavy piece of metal. An exclusive obsidian titanium black card. It was not a standard bank issue. It was an invitation-only tier of wealth, reserved for individuals whose net worth operated entirely outside the boundaries of normal banking limits. I pushed the cold metal into the trembling hand of Dr. Elias. "Charge the $250,000, I commanded, my voice growing steadier with every passing second. "Prep the operating room. We are doing the surgery." "We are." Dr. Elias stared at the heavy metal card. He flipped it over, seeing the crest of one of the most elite financial institutions in the world. He looked from the card up to my bruised face, realization dawning on him. I was not the helpless, low-level desk clerk my parents had painted me out to be. I was a woman who could buy and sell this entire hospital wing without checking my bank balance. He nodded firmly, his professional demeanor snapping back into place. "I will handle the administration immediately." He turned and bolted out the door, shouting orders to the nurses stationed down the hall to prep Surgical Theater 4. While the nurses scrambled outside my room, rushing to gather the necessary preoperative medications and equipment, I reached back into my bag and pulled out my personal phone. The screen cast a harsh glow across my face. I had a very short window of time before the surgical team would come in to sedate me properly, and I had a trap to set. Reginald Sterling paraded around Atlanta, acting like a self-made titan of industry. He hosted lavish galas in Buckhead, sponsored elite charity dinners, and boasted to anyone who would listen about his sprawling logistics empire. He looked down on me for taking a corporate job in New York right out of college. He called me a simple number cruncher who lacked the ambition and vision to run a real business. He favored Jasmine because she stayed close to home, played the role of the perfect socialite daughter, and married Trent. Trent was the perfect parasite. He sold my parents on the illusion of Silicon Valley prestige. He promised to elevate their old Southern wealth into the tech stratosphere with an app that was supposedly going to revolutionize the market. My parents were bleeding their own logistics company dry to fund his empty promises, desperate to maintain their proximity to white corporate elite status. What Reginald did not know was that my simple desk job was actually a position at Vanguard Financial, one of the most ruthless private equity firms in the country. Over a decade, I had climbed from a junior analyst to a managing director and finally to a senior partner. I specialized in forensic accounting and distressed asset acquisition. 3 years ago, when fuel prices spiked and Reginald's logistics fleet started bleeding cash, he took out a massive mezzanine loan to keep his company afloat. He thought he was dealing with a faceless corporate entity in Manhattan. He did not know his own daughter had bundled his debt, scrutinized his failing ledger, and personally bought out the loan through a proxy fund. I owned his company. I owned his trucks. I owned the very ground his warehouses sat on. I kept it a secret, hoping he would turn the business around, hoping I would never have to leverage my power against my own family. But hearing him sign my do not resuscitate order to save capital for Trent's fraudulent startup erased every ounce of loyalty I had left. The biometric scanner on my phone recognized my face and unlocked the screen. I opened my encrypted firm application, bypassing 3 layers of security protocols, and dialed the direct line to my offshore banking division. The line clicked open immediately. Vanguard Financial Executive Division. "This is Iman Sterling," I replied, staring at the sterile ceiling tiles. "Authorization code Delta 79er. Identity verified, Miss Sterling. How can we assist you today?" "I want a complete freeze placed on all outgoing transfers for Reginald Sterling's corporate and personal accounts." I commanded, my voice echoing coldly in the empty hospital room. "Lock them down entirely at the institutional level. I want a hard stop on the $500,000 wire transfer scheduled for tomorrow morning. Do not let a single cent leave his control." "Understood," the voice replied smoothly, the sound of rapid typing filtering through the speaker. "The freeze is active immediately. Will there be anything else?" "Yes. Activate the distress clause on his corporate debt." There was a brief pause on the line. The distress clause was a lethal legal trigger. It allowed Vanguard Financial to call in the entire principal of the loan immediately if there was suspicion of asset stripping or fraudulent wire transfers. By attempting to send $500,000 to Trent's fake tech startup while his company was overleveraged, Reginald had triggered the exact legal trap I had buried in his contract. Distress clause activated, the executive confirmed. "Notices of default will be generated and held for your final authorization. Hold them until I give the word." I ended the call just as the heavy double doors swung open again. A team of surgical nurses rushed into the room, maneuvering a mobile gurney alongside my bed. Dr. Elias stepped up beside me, holding a syringe of pre-operative anesthesia. He looked down at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of profound respect and lingering shock. "The payment cleared instantly," he said, his voice quiet, so the nurses would not hear. "The chief of surgery is waiting for you in the operating room. We are going to fix your spine, Iman." I nodded slowly, feeling the cold liquid enter my intravenous line. The burning agony in my back began to dull, replaced by a heavy, sweeping numbness that started in my fingertips and rushed toward my chest. As the nurses carefully transferred my broken body from the hospital bed to the gurney, I let my eyes drift shut. My father thought he was protecting his legacy by letting me die. He had no idea he had just handed me the keys to his complete and absolute destruction. The trap was set. Now all I had to do was wake up. 24 hours later, the intensive care unit was remarkably quiet. The world-class surgical team Dr. Elias had assembled performed an absolute miracle. The shattered vertebrae in my lower back had been meticulously fused and reinforced with state-of-the-art titanium supports. The agony that had radiated through my entire body just a day prior was gone, replaced by a dull, manageable ache and the profound, intoxicating sensation of healing. I was sitting up in my hospital bed, my spine completely stabilized. I was breathing on my own. I was alive. I held a warm cup of coffee in both hands, savoring the rich aroma as the morning sun filtered through the horizontal blinds. I was waiting. Right on schedule, the heavy double doors of the intensive care unit swung open. I kept my face perfectly neutral, masking the titanium strength of my newly repaired spine and the absolute ice in my veins. My father Reginald entered first, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, as if he were heading to a board meeting, rather than the deathbed of his eldest daughter. My mother Vivian followed close behind, draped in a dark designer coat, a large pair of sunglasses pushed up into her perfectly styled hair. Then came Jasmine, my younger sister dragging a Louis Vuitton weekender bag with a furious scowl on her face. And finally Trent, her husband, scrolling through his phone and chewing a piece of gum with aggressive indifference. They walked into the room expecting to find a lifeless body. They expected the machines to be silent. They expected to sign a few standardized release forms, shed a few performative tears for the hospital staff, and head straight to the bank to secure their wealth. Instead, they all froze. The collective shock that hit them was so powerful, it seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the room. Reginald stopped dead in his tracks, his polished leather shoes squeaking sharply against the linoleum, the color completely drained from his face. Vivian let out a strangled gasp, her manicured hand flying to her chest as she stumbled backward into Trent. Jasmine dropped her luxury bag right onto the floor with a heavy thud. Nobody rushed forward to hug me. Nobody cried tears of joy. Nobody fell to their knees thanking God for a miracle. They simply stared at me in absolute, unadulterated horror. I was sitting up sipping my coffee and looking right back at them. The disappointment radiating from my own parents was a physical weight in the room. They were looking at a financial liability that had stubbornly refused to expire. Reginald was the first to find his voice, though it cracked pathetically. Iman, you are sitting up. I lowered my coffee cup slowly, letting my hands tremble just a fraction to maintain the illusion of weakness. The doctors say it is a miracle, I whispered, keeping my voice soft and raspy. They found an anonymous donor program that covered the emergency spinal fusion last night. I'm going to make a full recovery. I watched the lie land. Reginald swallowed hard, a bead of sweat breaking out on his forehead. An anonymous donor. He looked at Vivian, who looked absolutely sick to her stomach. They thought some charity had stepped in to cover the $250,000 medical bill they had so callously refused to pay. They had no idea I was the one pulling the strings. Instead of expressing relief, Jasmine exploded. Her face twisted into a mask of pure self-centered rage. A miracle, she shrieked, her voice echoing loudly in the quiet ward. Do you know what kind of miracle it took to get our reservation at the Four Seasons in Cabo? Trent and I were already at the airport lounge. We had to cancel our entire luxury anniversary trip because Dad called and said we needed to come identify a body. We lost the non-refundable deposit, Iman. This false alarm has completely ruined my weekend. I stared at my sister. I had just survived a catastrophic car accident and major spinal surgery, and she was screaming at me over a canceled resort reservation in Mexico. My mother did not reprimand her. Vivian just sighed, adjusting her scarf to block out the hospital smell, clearly annoyed that my survival was causing such an inconvenience to their social calendar. Trent finally looked up from his phone, rolling his eyes as he pocketed the device. He leaned against the doorframe, projecting the kind of unearned arrogance only a mediocre man funded by his wife's family could possess. A passing nurse, a young black woman carrying a tray of medications, asked him politely to step aside so she could enter the room across the hall. Trent scoffed, refusing to move more than an inch. The service in this place is atrocious, he muttered loudly, ensuring the nurse heard his condescending tone. They let anybody work in these city hospitals nowadays. Absolutely no class. He then turned his attention away from me, entirely focusing his predatory gaze on my father. Look, Reginald, he said, clapping his hands together. I am thrilled Iman is pulling through. Truly a blessing. But Jasmine and I have a strict timeline to maintain. My developers in Silicon Valley are getting impatient. My investors are waiting on my green light. I assume this little medical detour will not delay my startup capital tomorrow morning. I need that $500,000 wire transfer cleared by 9 o'clock sharp. The sheer audacity of the man was breathtaking. He was standing in front of his wife's sister, whom he believed was fresh off her deathbed, and his only concern was draining my father's bank accounts to fund a non-existent tech application. Reginald nervously adjusted his silk tie, refusing to make eye contact with me. Do not worry about the capital, Trent. The bank opens at 8. I will go there personally and authorize the transfer myself. Nothing is going to delay your launch. I listened to them barter with my family's wealth, completely unaware that I had already frozen every single account Reginald Sterling owned. They were standing on a financial landmine, complaining about the view. I let my head fall back against the pillows, closing my eyes and letting out a weak, dramatic sigh. The medication is making me so dizzy, I whispered, letting my voice trail off into a pathetic rasp. Please, it is too much noise. I need to rest. I cannot keep my eyes open. The relief that washed over them was immediate and deeply insulting. They could not wait to escape my presence. Of course, sweetheart, Vivian said quickly, her voice dripping with fake maternal concern as she grabbed Jasmine's arm. You need your sleep. We will let you rest. Come along, Reginald. We have business to attend to. They did not offer a goodbye kiss. They did not promise to bring me fresh clothes. Jasmine snatched her Louis Vuitton bag off the floor, complaining loudly to Trent about needing an expensive brunch to calm her nerves. Reginald was the last to leave. He paused in the doorway, giving me one final calculating look before turning his back and walking away. The heavy hospital door clicked shut. The latch engaged. I was completely alone. The moment I heard their footsteps fade down the hallway, the facade shattered. I opened my eyes. The feigned weakness evaporated instantly. I sat up straight, ignoring the dull ache in my back, and swung the small tray table over my lap. I reached into my bag and pulled out my encrypted Vanguard financial laptop. I flipped it open, the screen glowing brightly in the quiet room. I typed in my complex alphanumeric password and bypassed the biometric security check. The familiar black and gold interface of the Vanguard executive terminal loaded onto the screen. My family thought I was a broken clerk resting in a hospital bed. They thought Trent was a genius visionary who was going to make them billionaires. It was time to expose the golden son-in-law. I pulled up the Federal Corporate Registry database and typed in Trent's name, along with the official title of his supposedly revolutionary tech startup. I cross-referenced it with Vanguard's proprietary forensic accounting software. The system began compiling data tracing every digital footprint, every tax filing, and every banking routing number associated with Trent's identity. I watched the progress bar load, my fingers poised over the keyboard. My family had sold my heartbeat for this man. Now I was going to see exactly what they bought. The loading screen vanished, replaced by a dense wall of financial data and offshore routing histories. I leaned in close to the screen, reading the first line of the report. My eyes narrowed into a cold, lethal glare. The first line of the Vanguard forensic report told me everything I needed to know about Trent and his supposedly revolutionary tech startup. The company was registered under the name Apex Synergy Holdings, but it did not exist in any physical capacity. There was no office building in Silicon Valley. There was no team of brilliant developers writing code late into the night. There was not even a patent application filed with the United States Patent and Trademark Office. Instead, the official business address was a mailbox at a strip mall shipping center in Delaware. I typed a rapid sequence of commands, navigating deeper into the financial architecture Trent had constructed. It was a classic shell company scam executed with the kind of sloppy arrogance that comes from never having been questioned or challenged. I traced the first injection of capital my father had provided him 6 months ago. Reginald had proudly announced at a family dinner that he was seeding Trent with $200,000 to build a prototype. My father had framed it as an investment in the family legacy, an opportunity to diversify their wealth into the booming tech sector. Looking at the digital ledger, I watched that $200,000 land in the Apex Synergy business checking account. It sat there for exactly 48 hours before being completely fragmented. Trent had not hired a single software engineer. He had not purchased any server space. Instead, he had immediately transferred $50,000 to a luxury car dealership to lease the brand new Porsche he drove around Buckhead. He had wired another $20,000 to an exclusive country club for a platinum membership upgrade. But the bulk of the money, the remaining $130,000, was funneled through a dizzying maze of digital transactions. Trent had created 3 dummy vendor accounts, billing his own company for fake consulting services. He paid those invoices, routing the money through a decentralized payment processor. From there, the funds evaporated from the domestic banking system, entirely crossing international borders until they quietly deposited into a private offshore account located in the Cayman Islands. He was not building an app. He was systematically draining my father's liquid assets and laundering the money overseas to build his own secret fortune. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the current quarterly statements. Trent had grown bolder. The initial $200,000 had not been enough to sustain his hidden offshore hoarding and his lavish local lifestyle. He had convinced Reginald that the app was entering a critical beta testing phase and required an immediate $500,000 cash injection to secure market dominance. And my father, blinded by his desperation to claim a piece of the tech industry prestige, had swallowed the lie completely. He was willing to sign a do not resuscitate order for his own daughter just to ensure this fraudster got his payout. The sheer stupidity of it all made my blood boil. Reginald Sterling considered himself a ruthless titan of industry. He terrified his employees and intimidated his competitors. Yet he was being effortlessly scammed by a mediocre man with a good golf swing and a practiced smile. I was in the middle of downloading the complete transaction history to a secure server when a sharp chiming sound erupted from my laptop speakers. A flashing red banner dropped down across the top of my screen. It was a high-priority alert from the Vanguard automated monitoring system. The system was detecting an active Level 4 override attempt on a frozen account. I clicked the banner, instantly bringing up the live banking feed. Reginald was at his bank in downtown Atlanta. I could see the exact terminal location and the employee identification number of the wealth manager he was sitting with. The live transaction log showed that the wealth manager had attempted to execute the $500,000 wire transfer to Trent's company, exactly as Reginald had promised just 30 minutes ago. The system had automatically rejected it, citing the global freeze I had placed on the account from my hospital bed. I could picture the scene perfectly. My father was likely pacing the plush carpet of the bank manager's office, his face red with indignation, screaming about incompetence and demanding the manager fix the glitch immediately. Reginald Sterling did not accept the word no from anyone, let alone a banking terminal. The live log updated on my screen. The wealth manager was trying to bypass the primary checking account. Reginald was instructing him to draw the $500,000 directly from the logistics company's operating credit line. He was attempting to leverage the very lifeblood of his business to pay Trent. The manager initiated the draw. The progress bar on the screen began to buffer. The system was checking the covenants of the loan. Because Vanguard Financial held the overarching debt of the logistics company, any major draw on the credit line required secondary authorization. A prompt flashed on my screen demanding Vanguard senior partner approval to release the funds. My father was desperate. He was standing in that bank office, willing to jeopardize his entire supply chain and the payroll of hundreds of employees just to keep his golden son-in-law happy. He believed he was completely in control of his empire. He had no idea that the final decision rested in the hands of the daughter he had just abandoned in an intensive care unit. I stared at the blinking cursor, waiting for my authorization code. The power was absolute. I could reject the transfer and let him throw a tantrum in the bank lobby. But a simple rejection would just make him look for another way to get the money. He would borrow against his house or liquidate his stock portfolios. He would never stop trying to fund Trent because his pride would not allow him to admit he had made a bad investment. I needed to stop the transfer, but I also needed to end the illusion permanently. I opened a secondary window on my terminal, directly accessing the Federal Financial Crimes Enforcement Network protocol. As a senior partner dealing in international distressed assets, I had direct reporting authority for suspected money laundering. I took the complete forensic file I had just compiled on Trent, the dummy vendor invoices, the Delaware Shell Company registration, and the routing numbers for the Cayman Island offshore accounts. I attached the entire data packet to the pending wire transfer request. I did not just click decline on the $500,000 transaction. I highlighted the destination account and reclassified the entire wire attempt under the federal code for active international money laundering. I linked my father's corporate credit line directly to Trent's fraudulent offshore network. The hospital room was completely silent save for the rhythmic beep of my heart monitor. I took a deep, steadying breath, ignoring the sharp twinge of pain in my healing spine. I positioned my finger over the enter key. This was the point of no return. Once I submitted this code, it was out of my hands and into the jurisdiction of the federal government. My father's precious logistics company, Trent's fake startup, the entire Buckhead socialite facade, it would all be reduced to ashes. I thought about my mother complaining that my medical emergency had ruined her luxury vacation. I thought about Jasmine whining about her canceled resort reservation while looking at my bruised body. I thought about Reginald's flat, emotionless voice telling Dr. Elias to let me go because saving my life was not a good investment. I pressed the enter key. The Vanguard terminal froze for a fraction of a second as the massive data packet encrypted and launched into the federal banking network. Then the screen refreshed. The pending wire transfer for $500,000 vanished. In its place, a solid crimson block covered the display. The text appeared in bold, stark letters. Transaction terminated. Federal flag triggered. Account frozen. Seizure imminent. The trap was no longer just set. It had been sprung. The jaws had snapped shut completely, severing Reginald's access to every single dollar he claimed to own. The federal banking system is ruthless and incredibly fast when money laundering is suspected. Within minutes, algorithmic locks would drop on every personal checking account, every corporate credit line, and every linked credit card bearing the Sterling name. The bank manager sitting across from my father would suddenly find himself locked out of the system, entirely legally obligated to call corporate security. I slowly closed the laptop and slid it back into my leather bag, pushing it under the hospital bed. I leaned back against the pillows, pulling the thin blanket up to my chest. A deep, profound sense of calm settled over me. I turned my head toward the window, watching the morning traffic move across the Atlanta skyline. Somewhere out there in a high-rise bank building, my father was about to swipe his card or demand his cash and find nothing but a blinking red error message. The empire he valued more than my life was officially dead. I took a slow sip of my coffee, waiting for the fallout. The morning sun had barely crested the Atlanta skyline when I signed my own discharge papers. The nursing staff protested frantically, warning me about the severe risks of moving so soon after an intensive spinal fusion, but I refused to listen. My private security team had already arrived with a specialized transport vehicle waiting at the hospital entrance. I declined the wheelchair they offered. I needed to walk into my parents' house on my own 2 feet. My body screamed in protest with every single movement. My ribs ached with a dull, heavy throbbing, and the surgical site on my lower back pulsed with a searing heat. But the adrenaline rushing through my veins was far more potent than any narcotic they could have prescribed. I dressed slowly and methodically, wrapping my bulky medical bandages tightly before slipping into a sharp-structured black designer winter coat. The thick wool perfectly concealed the medical braces and the cardiac monitors still taped to my skin. I looked pale, severely bruised, and incredibly dangerous. The humid summer air was thick and heavy as my driver pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates of my parents' Buckhead estate. Reginald and Vivian were hosting their annual summer kickoff party. It was the social event of the season for the Atlanta elite, an event my parents spent months planning just to prove their superiority to the rest of the neighborhood. A long line of luxury vehicles snaked down the pristine manicured driveway, handled swiftly by a team of white-gloved valets. A live jazz quartet played softly on the back lawn, the elegant music drifting through the open French doors of the mansion. I could hear the constant clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the manufactured, pretentious laughter of local politicians, real estate developers, and wealthy socialites. This was the superficial world my parents valued above my very existence. This was the glittering illusion they were willing to let me die for. I stepped out of the transport vehicle, forcing myself to stand perfectly straight, despite the sharp stab of pain shooting down my legs. I bypassed the valet stand entirely and walked directly through the massive mahogany front doors. The grand foyer was packed to the brim, with people dressed in light summer linens, bright pastels, and expensive silk. I stood right in the center of the room, wearing a heavy, dark winter coat in the middle of June. My face was battered with purple and yellow bruises from the car wreck, a stark, violent reality invading their pristine aesthetic. The contrast was incredibly jarring. The lively, booming chatter in the room began to die down instantly. People turned their heads to stare. Wealthy socialites paused with their drinks hovering halfway to their mouths. Frantic whispers rippled through the crowd like a sudden chilling breeze. I did not break my stride. Across the room I spotted my mother. Vivian was holding court with the mayor and his wife, wearing a custom floral gown, her hair perfectly blown out and styled. She was throwing her head back, laughing at a joke the mayor had just made, flawlessly playing the role of the ultimate Southern matriarch. And then her eyes locked onto mine across the crowded room. The laughter died instantly in her throat, the color completely drained from her perfectly contoured face. I watched the visceral horror wash over her features. It was not the horror of a mother seeing her severely injured child out of a hospital bed. It was the sheer, unadulterated panic of a socialite having her perfect event ruined in front of the most powerful people in the city. Vivian excused herself abruptly, her smile turning tight and frantic. She practically sprinted across the marble floor, her expensive heels clicking aggressively against the stone. She grabbed my arm, her manicured fingers digging directly into a bruised muscle. I flinched internally, but I did not give her the satisfaction of showing the pain. She did not ask how I was standing. She did not ask if I was okay. Instead, she leaned in close, her voice a venomous, desperate hiss. "What on earth are you doing here?" she demanded, her grip tightening as she physically forced me away from the grand ballroom and pushed me toward the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. "You are supposed to be in the intensive care unit. Look at you. You look like a corpse. Your bandages are ruining the entire aesthetic of the party. You are embarrassing us in front of the mayor." She shoved me roughly through the heavy wooden doors. The transition from the elegant, airy ballroom to the chaotic stainless steel catering kitchen was intense. Hired chefs and waiters scrambled around metal prep tables carrying trays of caviar and champagne, but Vivian snapped her fingers sharply, ordering every single one of them out. Within seconds, the massive kitchen was completely empty. I leaned against a cold metal counter, using it to take the weight off my burning spine. I looked at my mother, marveling at her absolute lack of humanity. "I just had major spinal surgery yesterday, Vivian," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm and steady. "And your first and only concern is the mayor's opinion of my outfit." Before she could even attempt to justify her vanity, the kitchen doors swung open again. Reginald stormed into the room, his face purple with absolute rage. He had seen the commotion from the outdoor patio and followed us inside. He slammed the heavy door shut behind him, trapping the three of us in the sterile, echoing room. He marched right up to me, pointing a thick, aggressive finger just an inch from my bruised face. "What kind of manipulative, sick game are you playing right now, Iman?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the stainless steel appliances. "The hospital administrator just called me. They said you signed yourself out against medical advice. You think you are clever, do you not? You think you can just walk out of there and stick me with that $250,000 medical bill. I told Dr. Elias I was not paying a single cent for that experimental procedure, and I meant it. You will not bankrupt this family just because you are too stubborn to use your own basic insurance." I stared at him, letting his furious words hang in the humid air of the kitchen. Bankrupt the family. The dark irony of his statement was so thick I could practically taste it. He had spent my entire life treating me like a massive financial burden, constantly reminding me how much my upbringing cost him, while simultaneously pouring millions of dollars into Jasmine's lavish lifestyle. I chose to build my own career, live in my own condo, and pay my own way precisely to escape his financial control and endless guilt trips. Yet here he was screaming in my face, accusing me of trying to steal his money on the exact day he was willingly handing $500,000 to a white con artist. "You do not have to worry about the medical bill, Reginald," I replied, my voice perfectly steady and dripping with ice. "It is already paid in full. I handled it myself. I just came here today to enjoy the party. After all, it is a massive day for the family. Trent is launching his revolutionary tech startup today, is he not? I would not want to miss the celebration of such a brilliant and historic investment." My father scoffed loudly, a harsh sneer twisting his features as he adjusted his expensive silk tie. "Do not speak about high-level business matters you do not understand. Trent is securing our legacy in the modern market. He is a visionary. That is something you would know absolutely nothing about sitting behind a tiny desk crunching numbers for a modest paycheck. You came here to cause a scene because you are jealous. You have always been jealous of your sister's happiness and the financial support we give her. You could not stand the fact that we are funding his genius while you have absolutely nothing to show for your life. You are a complete disgrace to my name. You have nothing without me." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or defend my career. I simply looked at him, feeling the absolute intoxicating power of knowing exactly what was about to happen. I reached over with one hand and poured myself a glass of sparkling water from a nearby crystal pitcher, taking a slow, deliberate sip. "I think you are going to find out exactly what I have to show for my life very soon," I said softly. Right on cue, the heavy, swinging kitchen doors burst open with such violent force that one of them slammed hard against the tiled wall. Reginald spun around, absolutely furious at the interruption, opening his mouth to scream at whatever hired waiter had dared to enter the room. But it was not a waiter. It was Trent. The golden son-in-law did not look like a visionary tech genius anymore. His designer linen suit was completely soaked in sweat clinging to his back. His face was blotchy bright red and contorted in unhinged absolute panic. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving up and down as if he had just sprinted a mile. The arrogant, condescending swagger he carried in the hospital room just 24 hours ago was completely gone, replaced entirely by the frantic, wide-eyed desperation of a trapped animal. He lunged across the kitchen, completely ignoring my presence, and shoved his cell phone directly into my father's face. The screen was glaringly bright, displaying an urgent banking alert. "Reginald, what the hell did you do?" Trent screamed, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "The bank just called me. The $500,000 wire transfer just bounced. My accounts are completely frozen. Everything is gone." Trent stood trembling in the center of the catering kitchen, his knuckles white as he shoved his mobile phone directly toward my father's chest. The screen illuminated the dim space between them, flashing a harsh, glaring red error message from his offshore banking application. The bold text practically screamed the reality of his situation, but Reginald simply stared at it, his brain entirely unable to process a world where his financial commands were denied. "Frozen." My father repeated the word, stumbling out of his mouth as if it belonged to a foreign language. "That is completely impossible. I authorized the draw from the corporate credit line myself. I spoke to the senior wealth manager at 8 o'clock this morning. Sterling Logistics has $50 million in liquid operating capital. A $500,000 wire transfer does not just bounce. It did bounce," Trent shrieked, his voice pitching up into a hysterical, unmanly octave. He was sweating so profusely that dark wet patches were blooming under the arms of his tailored linen suit. "The bank manager called me in an absolute panic 2 minutes ago. He said the Federal Reserve automatically intercepted the routing numbers. They locked down my receiving accounts. They locked down your outgoing corporate accounts. They locked down my personal credit cards. I went to the bar outside to order a drink, and the bartender told me my card was declined. Do you understand how humiliating that is? The mayor is right out there." Vivian let out a sharp, horrified gasp. "Keep your voice down, Trent," she hissed, her eyes darting frantically toward the heavy wooden doors. The jazz band is taking a break. If the mayor hears you screaming about declined credit cards in the catering kitchen, we will be the laughingstock of Buckhead by tomorrow morning. But Trent was far past the point of caring about social decorum. His entire fraudulent empire was collapsing around him in real time, and the primal fear of federal prison was overriding his country club manners. He paced the length of the stainless steel prep tables, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair until it stood up in frantic tufts. He muttered to himself frantically, trying to calculate how a foolproof offshore shell company had suddenly triggered a federal lockdown. Then his wild, bloodshot eyes landed on me. I was still leaning casually against the metal counter, my heavy designer coat wrapped tightly around my bruised body in surgical bandages. I was watching him with the detached clinical interest of a scientist observing a rat in a maze. Trent stopped pacing. His eyes narrowed, darting from my bruised face down to my coat, and then a sudden, desperate realization washed over his features. He remembered the mundane detail my parents loved to mock. He remembered where I worked. "It was you," Trent breathed out, his voice dropping into a venomous, trembling accusation. He pointed a shaking finger at me, closing the distance between us with aggressive, heavy steps. "You work for Vanguard Financial. Reginald's corporate credit line is managed through the Vanguard institutional tier. You did this." My father turned to me, his expression twisting into a mask of pure disbelief. "Iman, what is he talking about?" "She did this," Trent yelled, turning his desperate, sweating face toward my father. "You told her you were refusing to pay her medical bills. You told her you were using the capital to fund my app instead. She was lying in that hospital bed, bitter and jealous, and she used her little employee login to sabotage my launch." Trent took another step toward me, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of intimidation. "You work as a little number cruncher," he sneered, spit flying from his lips. "You are a glorified desk clerk. You must have messed up the routing numbers when you were supposed to be dying in that hospital bed. You flagged my account out of pure petty spite to trigger a fraud alert. You are completely pathetic." Vivian clutched her pearl necklace, looking at me with absolute disgust. "Iman, tell me you did not do something so incredibly vindictive. You are actively trying to ruin your sister's future because you are jealous of her husband." Reginald did not wait for an answer. His face darkened into a terrifying shade of crimson. The veins in his neck pulsed against his stiff white collar. He marched forward, his massive frame towering over me, completely ignoring the fact that I had a freshly fused spine. "I do not care how you did it," Reginald demanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that echoed off the tile walls. "I do not care what low-level clearance you abused to cause this glitch. You are going to pull your phone out right now. You are going to call whatever supervisor you report to at that firm, and you are going to tell them you made a massive clerical error. You are going to fix this immediately, Iman, or so help me God, you will never step foot in this house again." The silence that followed his threat was heavy and suffocating. The three of them stood there glaring at me, entirely convinced of their own false reality. Trent believed I was a petty, jealous clerk. Vivian believed I was a social embarrassment. Reginald believed I was a subordinate he could bully into submission. I did not reach for my phone, I did not apologize, I did not even blink. Instead, I reached across the stainless steel prep table. I picked up the heavy crystal pitcher resting near the catering trays. I calmly poured myself a glass of sparkling water, the ice clinking sharply against the glass in the dead silence of the room. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the cold water soothe my dry throat. "I didn't mess up anything, Trent," I said, my voice cutting through the humid air like a surgical scalpel. "The federal banking system automatically flags offshore money laundering. Your tech app doesn't exist." Trent flinched physically, as if I had just struck him across the face with a baseball bat. The remaining color drained from his cheeks, leaving him a sickly, terrifying shade of gray. "What are you talking about?" Reginald barked, looking back and forth between Trent and me. "What money laundering?" I set the crystal glass down on the counter. "Apex Synergy Holdings is not a technology startup." "Reginald," I stated, maintaining eye contact with my father. "It is a hollow shell corporation, registered to a strip mall mailbox in Delaware." Trent never hired a single software engineer. He never leased server space. He took the initial $200,000 you gave him 6 months ago and spent $50,000 on a new Porsche. He spent $20,000 upgrading his country club membership. Trent let out a strangled, breathless sound, backing away from me until his shoulders hit the heavy wooden door of the kitchen. The remaining $130,000, I continued, my voice steady and relentless, was funneled through 3 dummy vendor accounts for fake consulting fees. He routed your money through a decentralized payment processor and deposited it directly into a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands. He was not asking for a $500,000 wire transfer today to launch a beta test. He was asking for it because he needed to move the rest of your liquid capital offshore before you realized you were funding a ghost. Lies, Trent screamed, though his voice cracked and his knees were visibly shaking. She is lying, Reginald. She is just a bitter clerk making up financial terms to confuse you. I did not even look at Trent. I kept my gaze locked entirely on my father. I watched the gears turning in Reginald's mind. I watched him mentally process the Porsche, the country club, the constant delays in seeing a working prototype of the application. I watched the truth hit him squarely in the chest. But Reginald Sterling was a severe narcissist. He was a man who had built an empire on his own infallibility. Admitting that Trent had conned him meant admitting that he was a fool. It meant admitting that he had signed a do not resuscitate order for his own daughter just to protect a fraudulent investment. His ego was entirely incapable of processing that level of personal failure. His mind violently rejected the truth, choosing instead to protect his fragile pride. He turned his absolute unchecked fury directly onto me. "How dare you?" Reginald roared, stepping so close to me I could smell the expensive bourbon on his breath. "How dare you stand in my house and accuse my family of federal crimes just to cover up your own vindictive sabotage? You are a bitter, broken woman. You have spent your entire life trying to tear down the people around you because you are incapable of achieving greatness yourself." He raised his right hand high into the air, his large palm flattened fully, intending to strike me across the face to force my submission. "You are a disgrace to my name," he screamed, the spittle flying from his mouth. "You have nothing without me." I did not flinch. I did not cower. I stood perfectly straight, the titanium rods in my spine holding me absolute and unbreakable. I looked up at the hand suspended in the air, and then I looked directly into his furious, bloodshot eyes. I smiled, letting the cold, lethal reality of the situation shine through. "Check your email, Dad," I said softly, my voice echoing with total, absolute authority. "You don't own your name anymore." Reginald's hand stopped mid-air. The sheer, undeniable conviction in my voice pierced right through his blind rage. His eyes darted from my bruised face down to the pocket of his tailored charcoal suit, where his phone had just vibrated. Slowly, the threatening posture melted away, replaced by a sudden creeping dread. He lowered his arm, reached into his pocket, and pulled out the device. The screen lit up the dim space between us, displaying a high-priority notification. It was an email flagged with the stark, unmistakable crest of Vanguard Financial. I watched his pupils track back and forth as he opened the message. His breathing stopped. The silence in the catering kitchen was absolute, broken only by the faint, muffled sound of the jazz band playing outside. "Notice of default." Reginald whispered the words, barely making it past his lips. He sounded as if all the air had been violently punched out of his lungs. "Immediate asset seizure. Breach of loan covenants." He looked up, his jaw slack, his eyes wide with a terror I had never seen him display. "Vanguard is calling in the entire principal of the mezzanine loan. $30 million, payable immediately." He stared at the phone screen, rereading the legal jargon that was actively dismantling his empire. Then he looked at me. The final piece of the puzzle snapped into place in his mind. "You triggered the distress clause," he gasped, his voice trembling. "The attempted wire transfer. The algorithm flagged the offshore Cayman accounts as a fraudulent diversion of corporate assets. They are seizing the logistics fleet, the regional warehouses, the domestic operating accounts." He gripped the edge of the stainless steel prep table to keep his knees from buckling under his own weight. "You work for Vanguard." "I do not just work for them, Reginald," I said, my voice smooth, cold, and entirely devoid of pity. I am a senior partner in the distressed asset division. I personally bundled your toxic debt 3 years ago when fuel prices spiked and your company was bleeding cash. I bought out your failing loan through a proxy fund to keep this family afloat. I owned your trucks. I owned your warehouses. I owned the very ground your corporate headquarters sits on. All you had to do was run a clean business and pay your premiums. I took a step closer, letting the titanium rods in my spine support my posture, but you decided to strip your own company's equity to fund a con artist. You tried to leverage your employee payroll to wire $500,000 to a ghost company in Delaware, and worst of all, you signed my death warrant to save the capital to do it. Trent backed further away, shrinking into the corner near the walk-in freezer like a terrified rat. He had absolutely nothing to say. But Jasmine, entirely oblivious to the monumental corporate takeover happening right in front of her, stepped forward. The reality of shell companies and mezzanine debt flew completely over her head. All she understood was that I was the reason her luxury vacation was canceled, and I was the reason her husband was currently hyperventilating. "You are completely insane!" Jasmine shrieked, her voice shrill and grating against the tile walls. "You have always been unhinged. You are so consumed by your own toxic energy that you have to destroy everything good in my life. Trent is a genius. He is building a platform that is going to change the world, and you are just a bitter, jealous spinster who wants to ruin his life and Dad's business out of pure spite." She stomped her foot, her face twisted into a mask of entitled rage. "You are just mad because nobody wants you. You sit alone in New York crunching numbers while Trent and I are building a legacy. You hacked into Dad's bank just to punish us for being happy." Vivian did not care about the business. She did not care about the Cayman Islands or the seized logistics fleet. She cared about the jazz music filtering through the doors and the muffled murmurs of the elite guests waiting outside in her manicured gardens. The social hierarchy of Buckhead was her only reality, and I was currently threatening to detonate it. "Keep your voice down, Jasmine," Vivian hissed, though her own panic was reaching a fever pitch. She turned her venomous glare on me, her eyes sweeping over my bulky black coat and the visible medical tape protruding from my collar. "You have done enough damage for one lifetime, Iman. Look at you. You look like a battered stray animal. You are standing in my catering kitchen spewing corporate nonsense and trying to tear this family apart just to get attention." Vivian pointed a shaking finger toward the service exit at the back of the kitchen. "I want you out of my house this instant. I will not allow you to ruin the summer kickoff. The mayor is standing not 50 feet from here. The entire country club board is drinking my champagne. You will leave through the back door, and you will never speak of this delusion again." "It is not your house anymore, Mother," I stated, pouring the rest of my sparkling water into the sink. The estate was heavily leveraged as collateral against Reginald's corporate line of credit. "Vanguard owns the deed, which means I own the deed." Vivian's face twisted into a mask of pure, visceral ugliness. The carefully crafted Southern Belle facade completely evaporated. "You are a sick, pathological liar!" Vivian screamed, losing all sense of decorum. She lunged for the wall phone connecting directly to the neighborhood security gate. "I am calling the estate guards right now. I will have them drag you out by your hair and throw you onto the street. I do not care if you just had spinal surgery. I do not care if you bleed on my driveway. You are not going to embarrass me in front of high society. Get out." She was shaking so badly she knocked the receiver off the hook. It clattered against the tile floor, emitting a harsh, steady dial tone that underscored the absolute destruction of their perfect reality. Reginald remained slumped against the counter, staring blankly at his phone. Trent was practically trying to merge with the wall. Jasmine was breathing heavily, waiting for security to arrive and validate her delusion. I did not move toward the exit. I did not back down. The dull, persistent ache in my fused spine was a constant reminder of my own mortality, but it was entirely eclipsed by the massive, untouchable power I now held over the people who had tried to discard me like trash. I looked at Reginald, a broken titan who had lost his empire to his own arrogance. I looked at Trent, paralyzed by the looming threat of federal prison and offshore asset seizure. I looked at Jasmine, throwing a tantrum like a spoiled child whose favorite toy had been taken away. And I looked at Vivian desperately clinging to her social status while her entire world burned to the ground around her. "You want to talk about embarrassment, Vivian?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet cadence that cut through the dial tone ringing on the floor. "You have absolutely no idea what embarrassment looks like yet. But I am about to show you." I turned my back on my family. I walked straight toward the heavy wooden swinging doors that separated the sterile catering kitchen from the opulent sunlit grand ballroom. Vivian shrieked behind me, commanding me to stop, her voice cracking with pure terror. Reginald finally looked up from his phone, reaching a hand out as if to grab my coat, but he was entirely too late. I pushed the doors open with both hands. The bright light of the crystal chandeliers washed over my face. The booming chatter of 200 of Atlanta's most elite socialites, politicians, and business moguls instantly died away as I emerged from the kitchen. Dressed in a heavy black winter coat in the middle of a summer gala, my face covered in dark, violent bruises and medical tape, I walked with deliberate, unyielding steps right through the center of the crowd. The guests parted like the Red Sea. I bypassed the frozen socialites, ignoring their gasps and horrified whispers. I headed straight for the open French doors leading to the back patio. The live jazz band saw me approaching. The saxophone player lowered his instrument. The drummers stopped mid-beat. I stepped up onto the elevated wooden stage, looking out over the sea of perfect pastel dresses and tailored linen suits. I reached out and took the microphone directly from the lead singer's hands. The shrill, piercing whine of microphone feedback sliced through the humid Georgia air. It echoed across the manicured lawns and bounced off the stone facade of the Buckhead estate. The remaining murmurs of the crowd died instantly. 200 of Atlanta's most influential figures turned their collective gaze toward the elevated wooden stage. They expected a toast from Reginald, or perhaps a charming anecdote from the hired jazz band. Instead, they saw me. I stood dead center under the string lights, the heavy wool of my black winter coat, an aggressive contrast to the sea of silk, seersucker, and chiffon. My face was a tapestry of violent purple and yellow bruising. Thick, white surgical bandages crept up the side of my neck, peeking out from beneath my collar. I gripped the microphone stand with one hand to steady my burning spine. The silence that fell over the patio was not just quiet. It was a suffocating, paralyzing, absolute void. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice projecting crisp and clear through the massive outdoor speakers. "I know my attire is a bit out of season for the summer kickoff, but you will have to forgive me. I was just discharged from the intensive care unit less than 2 hours ago." A collective, localized gasp rippled through the front row of guests. I saw the mayor's wife bring a manicured hand to her mouth. Real estate moguls, tech investors, and prominent judges stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. In the periphery of my vision, I could see Reginald bursting through the French doors, followed closely by Vivian and a frantic, sweating Trent. Reginald opened his mouth to shout to order the sound engineer to cut the power, but he was entirely too late. I already had the floor, and these were exactly the people he could not afford to offend. "My name is Iman Sterling." I continued, my voice steady, betraying none of the agonizing pain shooting down my legs. "For those of you who do not know me, I am Reginald and Vivian's eldest daughter. I am the daughter they do not bring to the country club dinners. I am the daughter who does not feature in the holiday newsletters. And yesterday morning I was involved in a catastrophic car accident on Interstate 85 that crushed 2 vertebrae in my lower spine." The silence thickened. I could see the confusion warring with horror on the faces of the elite Black community leaders Reginald spent his entire life trying to impress. They looked from my battered face to Reginald, who was standing frozen at the edge of the patio, his fists clenched at his sides. "The trauma surgeons at Emory Hospital informed my family that I needed an immediate, highly specialized spinal fusion," I said, stepping slightly closer to the edge of the stage. "The procedure cost $250,000. It was not covered by standard insurance. It required out-of-pocket funding. And as I lay unconscious in a hospital bed, hovering between life and a permanent, paralyzing disability, the hospital administrators called my father to authorize the procedure." I paused, letting the heavy, humid air carry the weight of my words. I locked eyes with the mayor. Reginald Sterling declined to pay it. I stated, my voice echoing like a gavel striking wood. He told the surgical team that I was a poor investment. He told them that keeping me walking was not worth the reduction in his liquid capital. A low, horrified murmur began to build in the crowd. Men in expensive suits shifted uncomfortably. Women whispered behind their champagne flutes. Vivian had finally made it through the doors, her hands clawing at her perfectly styled hair, her eyes wide with a manic trapped terror. She was watching her entire social empire rot in front of her very eyes. Now you might be wondering what could possibly be more important to a father than his own daughter's ability to walk. I projected, raising my voice to cut through the rising whispers. You might be wondering where exactly Reginald needed to allocate those funds. Allow me to illuminate his brilliant financial strategy. He needed to save that money to fund his son-in-law. He needed it to fund Trent's revolutionary new technology startup. I pointed directly at Trent. He was standing near the buffet tables, his face the color of wet ash. He looked like a man standing on the gallows. Every head on the patio turned to look at him. Apex Synergy Holdings, I announced, pronouncing every syllable with dripping contempt. The brilliant visionary tech application Reginald has been bragging about at the golf course for the last 6 months. The venture that was supposed to secure the Sterling legacy. I hate to be the bearer of bad news to the investors in the crowd tonight. But Apex Synergy Holdings does not employ a single software developer. It does not own a single patent. It is a dummy shell corporation registered to a strip mall in Delaware. The murmurs erupted into loud, frantic chatter. Reginald stepped forward, his face purple, his mouth working silently as he tried to formulate a defense that did not exist. I did not give him a chance to speak. For the last 6 months, Trent has been funneling Reginald's corporate capital through fake vendor accounts, I said, leaning into the microphone. He took your investments, he took the corporate logistics funds, and he routed them directly into an offshore bank account in the Cayman Islands. He bought a Porsche. He upgraded his country club tier. And this morning, he attempted to wire $500,000 of Sterling Logistics operating capital out of the country before anyone realized he was running a massive textbook money laundering scheme. I watched a prominent venture capitalist in the second row slowly lower his drink to a passing waiter's tray. The man shook his head, looking at Reginald with absolute unadulterated disgust. The social execution was happening in real time. But the Federal Reserve does not care about country club aesthetics. I continued, my voice rising above the chaotic noise of the crowd. The wire transfer triggered a severe fraud alert. The accounts are completely frozen. Vanguard Financial has officially issued a notice of default. As of 10 minutes ago, Sterling Logistics is being actively seized for breach of loan covenants. The trucks, the warehouses, the corporate accounts. It is all gone. Reginald Sterling has bankrupted his entire empire to fund a con artist. The patio descended into absolute chaos. People were actively backing away from Reginald and Vivian as if their failure was a contagious disease. But I was not finished. I had one final lethal truth to deliver. I gripped the microphone stand, staring directly into my father's eyes. But financial ruin is just money, I said, my voice suddenly dropping to a low, chilling register that forced the crowd to quiet down and listen. Money can be lost. Money can be rebuilt. What you cannot rebuild is your soul. When the hospital told my father that his refusal to pay for the surgery might result in my death, he did not change his mind. To ensure he preserved the capital he needed for Trent's offshore Cayman accounts, Reginald Sterling signed a do not resuscitate order for his own daughter. The reaction was instantaneous and visceral. A woman near the front row actually dropped her crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the flagstone patio, a sharp, violent crash that perfectly punctuated the horror of my statement. He signed away my life to save a fraud, I declared, the microphone amplifying the raw, undeniable truth. He looked at my broken body, and he chose Trent's fake company. He chose to let me die. I am standing before you right now because I woke up, discharged myself against medical advice, and paid for my own surgery with the very firm that is currently seizing his assets. The social ruin was absolute. The wealthy elite of Atlanta, the people who prized family legacy and honor above all else, were looking at Reginald and Vivian as if they were monsters. The mayor did not say a word. He simply caught his wife's eye, shook his head, and turned his back on my parents. He began walking toward the exit. That was the catalyst. It was like watching a dam break. The most influential black community leaders, the politicians, Reginald had donated thousands of dollars to court the real estate moguls who had attended his dinners. They all set their drinks down on the nearest tables. They did not say goodbye. They did not offer their condolences. They simply turned in unison and began marching back through the house toward the valet stand. The mass exodus of Buckhead's elite was a silent, devastating stampede. Vivian could not process it. Her entire identity, her entire worth as a human being was wrapped up in the approval of the people who were currently fleeing her home in disgust. She let out a horrific, guttural wail. Her knees buckled beneath her. She collapsed right there on the flagstone patio in her custom floral gown. She dropped to the ground, sobbing hysterically, clutching at her hair as she watched her carefully curated social empire disintegrate into dust. Reginald stood paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing, his hands shaking. He had no power here. He had no authority to scream or demand respect. He was exposed as a complete, utter failure of a businessman and a monster of a father. But Trent was not paralyzed. Trent was watching the venture capitalists walk away. He was watching his entire grift evaporate. He was suddenly staring down the barrel of federal wire fraud charges, grand larceny, and a lifetime behind bars. His carefully maintained facade of the brilliant, arrogant tech genius completely shattered, leaving only a desperate, cornered animal. His eyes locked onto me standing on the stage. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. He let out a feral, aggressive scream that tore through his throat. "You ruined everything!" he roared, his voice cracking with madness. He shoved past a fleeing socialite, his heavy shoes pounding against the stone patio as he sprinted directly toward the stage. His fists were balled, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He did not care about the witnesses. He did not care about the security guards standing at the perimeter. Driven by pure, violent desperation, Trent lunged toward the platform, throwing his entire body weight forward to physically attack me. Trent was a desperate, flailing mass of linen and panic. He hurtled the short distance between the buffet table and the stage, his arms outstretched, his face contorted into a mask of pure homicidal rage. He intended to tackle me to the wooden floor, to physically crush the truth out of my throat, and to silence the absolute destruction of his fraudulent empire. I did not step back. I did not raise my arms to defend myself. I simply watched him come, knowing perfectly well he would never reach me. Before Trent's foot even hit the first step of the stage, the crowd erupted into a fresh wave of panic. Two men who just moments before had been seamlessly blending into the party as wealthy investors in tailored charcoal suits surged forward with terrifying calculated speed. These were not hired country club guards. This was my personal, highly trained private security detail, veterans of corporate espionage and high-threat protection. The taller of the two operatives intercepted Trent mid-lunge. He caught Trent by the lapels of his sweat-soaked jacket, used Trent's own momentum against him, and viciously swept his legs out from under him. Trent hit the imported marble floor of the patio with a sickening, bone-jarring crack. The air exploded out of his lungs in a wet, heavy gasp. Before he could even attempt to thrash or struggle, the second operative was on top of him. He wrenched Trent's arms behind his back, driving a heavy knee directly between his shoulder blades, pinning the so-called tech visionary flat against the stone like a captured insect. Trent whined a high, pathetic sound of absolute defeat, his cheek pressed hard against the cold marble. Jasmine snapped out of her frozen stupor. Seeing her perfect golden husband slammed into the ground by strangers finally registered in her highly manicured reality. "Get off him!" she shrieked, her voice tearing through the humid night air. She lunged forward, her expensive silk dress catching on the edge of a chair, but she ignored it, scrambling toward the security guards. "Reginald, do something. They are hurting him. Dad, call the police. Make them stop." Reginald did nothing. He stood exactly where he was, his hands trembling at his sides, his eyes locked on the men pinning his son-in-law to the floor. Reginald was a bully who only understood power. Looking at my security detail, looking at the absolute untouchable authority I commanded without lifting a single finger, Reginald finally understood that he had been completely outmatched. He was a ruined man, and he had absolutely no authority left to yield. I descended the short wooden steps of the stage, my heavy black winter coat sweeping against the railing. The remaining socialites, those too paralyzed by the unfolding drama to join the mass exodus, pressed themselves flat against the edges of the patio, desperate to stay out of my way. I signaled to a woman in a sleek navy blue dress standing near the French doors. She was the lead investigator on my asset recovery team. She stepped forward immediately, handing me a thick, heavy red folder. I walked directly toward Jasmine. She was kneeling on the marble, her hands hovering uselessly over Trent, sobbing and glaring up at me with sheer, unadulterated hatred. "You are a monster!" Iman Jasmine spat, her makeup running down her cheeks in dark, messy streaks. "You are doing this because you are a toxic, miserable woman. You could not stand seeing Trent succeed. You could not stand seeing me happy. You planned this whole attack just to ruin our lives because you have absolutely nothing of your own." I stopped right in front of her. I looked down at her tear-streaked face, marveling at how deeply she had bought into her own manufactured fairy tale. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "I am not the one who ruined your life, Jasmine," I said, my tone perfectly even and deadly cold. "I am just the one handing you the receipt." I tossed the thick red folder directly onto her lap. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud against her silk dress. Jasmine flinched, looking at the bright red cover as if it were a venomous snake. "Open it," I commanded. Jasmine shook her head, pressing her hands against her ears. "No. I am not looking at whatever fake spreadsheets you printed out to frame my husband. He is a genius. You are a liar. Your husband is not just stealing from Reginald." I continued, my voice carrying clearly over her pathetic denials. "He has been systematically bankrupting your personal trust fund for the last 12 months. Jasmine froze. Her hands slowly lowered from her ears. The trust fund was her lifeline. It was the $5 million safety net Reginald had set up exclusively for his golden child, the money that funded her endless shopping sprees, her European vacations, and her pristine lifestyle. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her eyes darting to Trent, who was suddenly thrashing desperately under the guard's knee, trying to scream at her not to look. "Trent forged your signature on a joint power of attorney last July," I explained, forcing her to confront the absolute reality of her marriage. "He took the deed to your Buckhead condo. He took the principal of your trust. He leveraged every single cent you owned to cover the massive gaping holes in his dummy corporation before he started stealing from Reginald. Your accounts are at zero, Jasmine. You do not own your home. You do not own your cars. You are completely and utterly destitute." Shaking uncontrollably, Jasmine reached down and flipped open the red cover. The first page was a certified bank statement from her primary wealth management account. The balance, which had historically hovered in the high seven figures, read negative $40,000. She flipped to the next page. A notice of foreclosure on her luxury condominium. She flipped to the next. A massive line of credit signed with a blatant forgery of her own handwriting. Trent whimpered from the floor, a miserable, cowardly sound. "Jasmine, baby, please do not look at it," he pleaded, his voice muffled against the stone. "I was going to fix it. I was going to win it all back with the app. I swear to God." Jasmine was hyperventilating, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into the thick stack of financial ruin. She was weeping, staring at the zeros that dictated her new reality. But I was not going to let her stop there. Financial ruin was only the beginning of Trent's betrayal. "Keep turning the pages, Jasmine," I instructed, my voice cutting through her rising panic. "Look at the back of the folder. See exactly where your husband has been investing your inheritance." Jasmine turned past the bank statements. She turned past the foreclosure notices, and then she stopped. The heavy paper fell away to reveal a stack of high-definition, full-color surveillance photographs. I watched the absolute destruction wash over her features as her brain tried to process the images. The first photograph showed Trent walking out of a beautiful sprawling brick home in Sandy Springs, a wealthy suburb miles away from their own condo. The second photograph showed Trent standing in the driveway, wrapping his arms around a stunning, smiling woman with dark hair. The third photograph showed Trent hoisting a toddler onto his shoulders while the dark-haired woman held a newborn baby wrapped in a pink blanket. "He did not just lose your money playing venture capitalist Jasmine," I said, leaning down slightly to ensure she heard every single word. "He used your trust fund to buy that 5-bedroom house in Sandy Springs in cash. He used your inheritance to set up a fully funded secret second family. He has been living a double life for 3 years. That toddler on his shoulders is 2 years old. That means he started this second family while you were busy planning your lavish anniversary party. You paid for his mistress's mortgage. You paid for his new children. You funded the family he actually wanted." Jasmine stared at the photograph of Trent kissing another woman on the cheek. She stared at the toddler who shared her husband's exact smile. She stared at the brand new luxury SUV parked in the driveway of a home she had unknowingly purchased. The golden child of the Sterling family, the woman who had spent her entire life believing she was superior to everyone around her, finally understood that her entire existence was a carefully orchestrated lie. Her perfect marriage was a grift. Her immense wealth was gone. Her husband belonged to someone else. The denial completely evaporated, leaving behind a raw, cavernous void of absolute betrayal. Jasmine clutched the surveillance photograph to her chest, her knuckles turning bone white. She looked down at Trent, who could not even bring himself to meet her eyes. She threw her head back toward the dark summer sky, her mouth opening wide. The sound that ripped from her throat was not a cry. It was not a sob. It was a visceral, blood-curdling scream of pure, unfiltered agony that echoed through the empty ballroom and out into the humid Georgia night, shattering the final lingering remnants of the Sterling family legacy. The raw, terrifying sound of Jasmine's scream shattered the humid night air, ripping through the final remnants of the Sterling family facade. The thick red folder slipped from her lap, and dozens of glossy surveillance photographs scattered across the imported marble patio. Images of Trent smiling with his secret toddler kissing his hidden mistress and standing in the driveway of the Sandy Springs home he had purchased with Jasmine's drained trust fund lay completely exposed under the elegant string lights. The total psychological collapse of the golden child was not a quiet affair. Jasmine lunged. She threw herself at her husband with the feral intensity of a woman who had just realized her entire reality was a parasitic illusion. Her manicured hands curled into claws. She grabbed the collar of Trent's ruined linen suit, tearing the expensive fabric as she slammed her fists against his chest. Trent scrambled backward like a coward. He raised his arms to shield his face completely, abandoning any remaining shred of his suave, arrogant persona. He scrambled like a crab on the polished stone, crying and begging for her to listen. "Jasmine, baby, please," he sobbed, his voice cracking as she struck him again. "Let me explain. I was going to pay it all back. I just needed more time." "You stole my life," Jasmine shrieked, her voice tearing at her vocal cords. "You stole my money. You bought them a house. You bought them a house with my money." She grabbed a half-empty champagne bottle from a nearby cocktail table and hurled it at him. It smashed against the stone pillar inches from his head, showering him in glass and expensive alcohol. My private security detail did not intervene. They simply stepped back, forming a solid, impenetrable wall of charcoal suits between the domestic carnage and myself. I stood on the edge of the stage, watching the violence unfold with absolute chilling detachment. A few feet away, Vivian was completely falling apart. My mother lay crumpled on the patio, her custom floral gown soaked in spilled champagne and shattered crystal. She was clutching her chest, taking short, ragged, hyperventilating gasps. The social execution had broken her mind. Her chest heaved violently, and her perfectly styled hair was plastered to her sweating face. She reached a trembling hand out into the empty air. "Reginald," Vivian gasped, her eyes wide with sheer panic. "Reginald, please, help me. I cannot breathe. Do something. Call an ambulance. Fix this." But Reginald Sterling did not step forward to comfort his hyperventilating wife. He did not step forward to separate his golden daughter from the fraudulent husband who had just bankrupted her. I watched my father look at the absolute wreckage of his family on the marble patio, and I watched him make his choice. Reginald turned his back on all of them. He spun around, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat, and he practically sprinted through the open French doors back into the empty, echoing mansion. He was abandoning his wife. He was abandoning his daughter. The only thing Reginald Sterling cared about in the entire world was his money, and he was running away to try and save it. I did not let him escape. I gestured to the lead operative of my security detail. "Keep them contained out here." I instructed, my voice flat and authoritative. "Make sure the police are not called. Let them tear each other apart." The operative nodded sharply. I turned and followed my father into the house. The grand ballroom, which just 20 minutes ago had been packed to the brim with Atlanta's most powerful politicians and socialites, was now completely deserted. The silence in the massive vaulted room was deafening. Half-empty champagne flutes sat abandoned on cocktail tables. Discarded linen napkins littered the floor. It looked like the site of a sudden catastrophic evacuation. I walked slowly across the hardwood floors. My spine throbbed with a dull, heavy heat, the surgical site protesting the sheer amount of time I had spent standing. But the adrenaline surging through my veins was a powerful anesthetic. I tracked my father's heavy, frantic footsteps down the long, carpeted hallway toward the east wing of the estate. He was heading for his sanctuary, the mahogany-paneled home office where he had spent my entire childhood ignoring me, counting his money and building the corporate empire he had just lost. I reached the end of the hallway. The heavy double doors to his office were shut tight. I reached out and turned the brass handle. It was locked from the inside. I stepped back, motioning to the second security operative who had shadowed me into the house. "Open it," I commanded. The operative did not hesitate. He raised a heavy tactical boot and delivered a single, devastating kick directly next to the locking mechanism. The heavy oak doors splintered and burst inward, slamming against the interior walls with a violent, echoing bang. I stepped through the shattered doorway and leaned casually against the wooden door frame, letting the solid wood take the weight off my aching back. Reginald was pacing frantically behind his massive executive desk. The room was dark, illuminated only by the glaring light of his computer monitors and the glowing green light of the speakerphone sitting on his desk. He was sweating profusely. His tie loosened, his suit jacket discarded on the floor. He jumped violently when the doors crashed open, his eyes darting to me with a mixture of terror and absolute venomous hatred. He immediately raised a thick, shaking finger, pointing it directly at my face in a frantic, silent command for me to shut up. He turned his attention back to the speakerphone, his voice dripping with a pathetic, groveling desperation I had never heard him use before. "Marcus, please, you have to listen to me," Reginald begged, leaning over the desk so his mouth was inches from the microphone. "You are the managing director of Vanguard Financial. You have the authority to halt this asset seizure. This is a massive misunderstanding. There is no fraud. There is no money laundering. This is a malicious cyber attack from a disgruntled employee." I crossed my arms over my winter coat, watching my father systematically dig his own grave. He was completely shameless. "Reginald," a calm, deeply professional voice echoed out of the speakerphone. "The automated systems do not trigger a full corporate lockdown and a notice of default over a simple misunderstanding. You attempted to wire $500,000 of liquid operating capital to an offshore dummy corporation in the Cayman Islands. That is a direct, undeniable violation of your mezzanine loan covenants. The capital is seized. The logistics fleet is grounded." "It was not me," Reginald shouted, his voice pitching up into a hysterical panic. He pointed his shaking finger at me again, his eyes filled with a dark, murderous intent. "It was my daughter. She did this. She is a low-level accounting clerk at your firm. She has access to the institutional tier portals." I raised an eyebrow, my expression entirely impassive as I listened to my own father frame me for federal cybercrimes to save his logistics trucks. "Marcus, you have to understand my situation," Reginald pleaded the lies spilling out of his mouth like toxic sludge. My daughter is severely mentally unwell. She is incompetent. She was just in a horrific car accident, and she is having a complete psychological break. She is jealous of her sister. She is jealous of my success. She stole my corporate credentials and initiated this fraudulent freeze out of pure unadulterated spite. You have to trace the IP address. You have to arrest her. I am the victim here, Marcus. I am begging you. Give me a 48-hour extension to clear the routing numbers and fix my incompetent daughter's banking error. I can have my lawyers send you her medical records to prove she is insane. Just release my accounts. Reginald was practically weeping into the speakerphone. He had completely abandoned his role as a father, a husband, and a man of honor. He was willing to have me thrown into a federal penitentiary. He was willing to declare me legally insane. He was willing to strip away my entire future just to maintain his grip on his precious company. I did not feel anger. I did not feel sadness. I simply felt an overwhelming absolute vindication. Every single choice I had made to secure my own power was entirely justified. A heavy, unbroken silence hung in the air of the home office. The speakerphone hummed with soft electronic static. Reginald held his breath, leaning heavily on his knuckles against the polished mahogany desk, waiting for his pathetic lies to save his empire. I pushed myself off the doorframe and took 2 slow, deliberate steps into the room. I looked directly at the speakerphone. The calm, professional voice of the managing director finally echoed back through the device, cutting through Reginald's desperate, suffocating silence. I don't make those decisions. Reginald Marcus stated, his tone devoid of any sympathy. You need to speak to the senior partner who personally holds your debt. In fact, she should be standing right in front of you. The mechanical click of the speakerphone disconnecting sounded like a gunshot in the dead silence of the mahogany-paneled office. The line went completely dead, but Marcus's final words hung suspended in the heavy air-conditioned atmosphere. Reginald did not move. He did not breathe. His hand remained frozen in midair, hovering over the glowing green button of the office phone. Slowly, agonizingly, his eyes dragged upward from the polished surface of his executive desk to meet my gaze. The arrogant, untouchable patriarch of the Sterling family was gone. In his place stood a hollow, terrified shell of a man whose brain was violently short-circuiting as it tried to process the impossible reality standing in his doorway. I stepped fully into the room, my heavy boots thudding softly against the imported Persian rug. The security operative who had kicked the door open stepped back into the hallway, standing guard, and ensuring we were completely undisturbed. I walked right up to the edge of the massive desk, looking down at the man who had spent 34 years making me feel completely invisible. You really should update your intelligence gathering, Reginald, I said, my voice smooth and dangerously calm. You spent a decade mocking my career choice. You told your country club friends I was a glorified bookkeeper, a pathetic little desk clerk, pushing numbers for a firm that would never value me. You assumed that because I did not flaunt my money with leased luxury cars and fake tech startups, I must be struggling. Reginald's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blood had entirely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He gripped the edge of the desk so hard his knuckles turned white, desperately trying to anchor himself to a kingdom that no longer existed. I am not a low-level accountant. I continued enunciating every syllable with surgical precision. I am the senior partner of the Distressed Asset Division at Vanguard Financial. Over the last 10 years, while you were bleeding this company dry to maintain your social status, I was quietly amassing a personal net worth that eclipses yours by a factor of 10. I built an empire in silence. And when Sterling Logistics started defaulting on its vendor payments 3 years ago, when the banks refused to extend your credit, I was the one who stepped in. Reginald shook his head side to side, a pathetic jerky motion of pure denial. No, he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Vanguard bought the mezzanine debt. Vanguard approved the restructuring. I bought the mezzanine debt. I corrected him, leaning forward slightly, forcing him to look at the bruises covering my face. I authorized the restructuring through a proxy fund I personally manage. I used my own capital to swallow your toxic, rotting loans because I actually wanted to save this family's legacy. I owned your warehouses. I owned your freight contracts. I owned the deed to this very house. I gave you the absolute easiest terms legally possible. All you had to do was run a clean, honest business and pay your minimum premiums. The realization finally shattered the last remaining wall of his ego. The absolute magnitude of my power over him crushed the breath out of his lungs. He was not looking at a disappointing daughter. He was looking at his executioner, the sole proprietor of his entire existence. But you could not even manage that, I said, my tone dripping with absolute disgust. You bypassed my firm. You leveraged the payroll accounts to fund Trent's offshore ghost company. You violated the covenants of the proxy fund, triggering the automatic seizure protocols. I did not initiate a cyber attack, Reginald. I simply let the automated fraud algorithms do their job after you handed a con artist the keys to the vault. Reginald's legs gave out. The sheer overwhelming weight of his failure caused his knees to buckle. He collapsed behind the desk, sliding down the leather executive chair until he hit the floor with a heavy, unceremonious thud. The great Reginald Sterling, the man who demanded absolute perfection and submission from everyone around him, crawled out from behind the desk on his hands and knees. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face, completely abandoning every ounce of dignity he possessed. "Iman, please!" Reginald wept, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch. "Please, baby, you have to stop this. You have to call Marcus back. You have to tell them to release the holds." I was stressed. You have no idea the pressure I have been under. The supply chain issues, the fuel costs, the investors breathing down my neck. I was desperate. Trent promised me a 50% return on the initial seed capital. He manipulated me. He lied to me. I was just trying to secure our future. I am your father. You cannot do this to your own father. He reached out his trembling hands, grasping blindly at the hem of my black winter coat. I did not step back. I simply looked down at his grasping hands with absolute revulsion. Stressed, I repeated the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. You were stressed about your profit margins, so you decided to overlook massive, glaring red flags and wire corporate funds to a strip mall in Delaware. You call that securing our future? I leaned down, forcing him to look directly into my eyes, forcing him to see the white medical tape securing the stitches on my neck. Let us talk about securing futures, Reginald. Let us talk about yesterday morning. Let us talk about the trauma surgeon calling you from the intensive care unit, telling you that your eldest daughter needed an emergency spinal fusion to avoid permanent paralysis. Reginald flinched violently, pulling his hands back as if my coat had suddenly caught fire. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head rapidly, desperate to avoid the reality of his own monstrous behavior. The surgery cost $250,000 out of pocket, I stated, my voice echoing off the dark wood panels of the office. $250,000. For a man who regularly drops $50,000 on a country club charity auction just to hear his name announced over a microphone, that amount is nothing. It is a rounding error, but you told the hospital administrators no. I was trying to move funds around. Reginald sobbed, bowing his head toward the floor, unable to bear the weight of my gaze. I did not have the liquid cash. The accounts were tied up in the escrow transfer for Trent's application launch. I thought insurance would cover it. I thought they were exaggerating the timeline. I was going to pay it. I swear to God, Iman, I was going to pay it. You are a liar, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly quiet. You did not ask for a payment plan. You did not ask for a delay. When the doctors informed you that without the surgery, the swelling in my spinal cord could cause respiratory failure and kill me, you made a calculated financial decision. You decided that my life, my ability to walk, my ability to breathe, was a poor return on investment. You needed to preserve that specific block of liquid capital so you could wire it to Trent's Cayman Island accounts this morning. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing him to shrink back against the legs of his desk. You signed a do not resuscitate order. I said the words slicing through the room with lethal precision. You put your signature on a legal medical document, instructing the surgical team to let me expire on the table so you would not be held liable for the outstanding medical debt. You traded my life for a shell company. You sacrificed my spinal cord to fund your son-in-law's secret second family. Reginald covered his face with his hands, sobbing loudly, a pathetic, broken sound that echoed pitifully in the opulent space. He had absolutely no defense. The raw, undeniable truth of his greed had completely stripped away his humanity, exposing the hollow, rotting core of his character. He was weeping for himself, mourning the destruction of his wealth, completely incapable of feeling genuine remorse for the daughter he had tried to discard. I stood over him, feeling nothing but a cold, absolute sense of closure. The terrified, desperate little girl who had spent 3 decades seeking this man's approval was completely dead. The woman standing in her place was a titanium-forged force of nature, and she was entirely done playing his games. Before I could deliver the final crushing blow to his shattered ego, the splintered remains of the office doors were violently shoved aside. Vivian burst into the room. She was a horrifying vision of ruined aristocracy. Her custom designer gown was torn at the hem and stained with spilled alcohol. Her usually immaculate hair was a tangled, chaotic mess around her shoulders. Her face was streaked with dark mascara, tracks her eyes wide, manic, and completely unhinged. She had clearly fled the patio after witnessing the total destruction of Jasmine's marriage, desperate to find the one man who had always shielded her from reality. But instead of finding her powerful husband managing a crisis, she found Reginald collapsed on the floor, weeping like a beaten child at the feet of the daughter they had both deemed worthless. The sight broke whatever fragile thread of sanity Vivian was clinging to. She let out a ragged, desperate gasp, rushing across the room and dropping to her knees beside Reginald. She grabbed his arm, shaking him violently, trying to force him to stand, trying to force him to be the titan she demanded him to be. But he was dead weight, completely unresponsive to her frantic pulling. Vivian turned her manic, tear-streaked face up toward me. She saw the absolute lack of mercy in my eyes, the unyielding posture of a woman who held the deed to her entire life. Her usual tactics of condescension and mockery had been completely neutralized. She had no leverage, no authority, and no escape. So she played the only card she had left. She reached for the ultimate heavily weaponized manipulation tactic that had governed our lives for decades. She weaponized our blood. "We are blood, Iman!" Vivian screamed, her voice cracking with pure, desperate hysteria. She clawed at the air between us, her eyes wide with a frantic, begging terror. "We are a black family. Do you understand what that means? We have to stick together against the world. You cannot do this to us. You cannot tear down your own people to satisfy a grudge. We are your family. You belong to us." The words hung in the stagnant air of the shattered home office, toxic and completely absurd. I looked down at my mother. Vivian was kneeling on the imported Persian rug. Her custom floral gown ruined, her hands clasped together in a desperate, pathetic gesture of prayer. She was breathing so heavily I could hear the faint wheeze in her throat. She had spent her entire life curating an image of untouchable elite perfection. She had demanded that everyone in her orbit adhere to her strict, suffocating standards of social grace. And now she was weaponizing the very concept of family and racial solidarity to save herself from the consequences of her own horrific actions. "Blood," I repeated, letting the word roll off my tongue as if it were a completely foreign concept. I took a slow, agonizing step toward her, feeling the heavy, throbbing ache in my fused spine with every movement. "You want to talk about blood now, Vivian? You want to talk about sticking together against the world?" I looked from her tear-streaked face to Reginald, who was still slumped against his mahogany desk, staring blankly at the floor. "You did not care about blood yesterday morning," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, resonant register that commanded the absolute attention of the room. "You stuck together when you signed my death warrant. You stood shoulder to shoulder as a family when the trauma surgeon told you I was going to stop breathing. And you collectively decided that my life was not worth the financial inconvenience." Vivian flinched, as if I had struck her across the face. She opened her mouth to argue, to deploy another manipulative excuse, but I cut her off instantly. "You sold my heartbeat to fund a white con artist." I stated, my tone razor sharp and entirely devoid of mercy. You sacrificed your own eldest daughter to buy into a fraudulent tech startup because you were so blinded by your own desperate need for status. Do not dare weaponize our culture to cover up your greed. Do not ever use the concept of black family loyalty to justify why you left me to die in a hospital bed. You do not care about our community. You care about country club memberships and summer galas. And now you have absolutely nothing. The absolute brutal truth of my words physically broke her. Vivian let out a long, hollow sob and collapsed forward, pressing her forehead against the rug. She wrapped her arms around her head, hiding her face, completely defeated. She had no more cards to play. Her manipulation was utterly useless against a woman who had already accepted her own death and walked away from it. Reginald finally lifted his head. His eyes were completely bloodshot, his face a portrait of total devastation. He looked at me, the daughter he had dismissed as a lowly accountant, the woman who now owned the very ground he was kneeling on. Iman, he croaked, his voice raw and broken. What do you want from me? I will do anything. I will sign the company over to you. I will give you the house. Just please call Vanguard. Stop the asset seizure. I can fix this. I can make it right. You have nothing left to give me, Reginald, I replied coldly. I already took it. Before he could process the absolute finality of my statement, a heavy dragging sound echoed from the hallway. My two private security operatives stepped through the shattered doorway. Between them, they hauled the limp, struggling form of Trent. His linen suit was torn. His face was pale and slick with terror, and a large purple bruise was already forming on his cheekbone where he had met the patio floor. The operatives tossed him unceremoniously onto the rug next to Reginald. Trent scrambled backward, his eyes wide and manic, looking desperately for a way out. He was a cornered rat, realizing the maze was entirely sealed off. He looked at me, his chest heaving. You cannot do this, Trent stammered, pointing a shaking finger at me. I have lawyers. I have investors. You cannot just freeze my accounts based on a glitch. I will sue you for everything you have. I will ruin you. I did not even bother to respond to his pathetic threats. I simply turned my head toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that lined the back wall of the office, overlooking the expansive manicured driveway and the front gates of the Buckhead estate. At that exact moment, the dark, humid Georgia night was suddenly violently illuminated. A brilliant, blinding flash of red light swept across the mahogany walls of the office, immediately followed by a stark, piercing flash of blue. The colors rotated rapidly, painting the room in the unmistakable, urgent strobe of law enforcement. A second later, the heavy, bone-rattling wail of multiple police sirens pierced the air, echoing loudly through the wealthy, usually silent neighborhood. The sound of heavy tires screeching against the gravel driveway confirmed their arrival. Car doors began slamming in rapid succession. Reginald gasped, scrambling backward against his desk. Vivian lifted her head from the rug, her eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated horror as the red and blue lights washed over her tear-stained face. The social ruin had been devastating, but the arrival of law enforcement was the ultimate, inescapable reality of their destruction. The elite guests had fled, but the authorities had arrived to clean up the wreckage. Trent froze. His eyes darted to the windows, watching the chaotic flashing lights illuminating the front lawn. The false bravado completely evaporated from his body. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He was not just facing a corporate freeze. He was facing the full, crushing weight of the federal justice system. He scrambled to his feet, his dress shoes slipping frantically against the expensive rug. He spun around, looking desperately at the shattered office doors, then at the French doors leading out to the back patio. He was acting on pure, mindless survival instinct. He lunged toward the back door, his hands outstretched, desperate to escape into the gardens and disappear into the night before the officers could reach the house. The two security operatives immediately shifted their weight, stepping effortlessly into his path and blocking the exit like twin walls of solid concrete. Trent slammed into them, bouncing off their chests and stumbling backward. He was completely trapped. Trent whipped his head around to face me, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic panic. He looked at the flashing blue lights reflecting off my face. "What did you do?" Trent screamed, his voice cracking with sheer terror. "What did you do to me?" I stood perfectly still, letting the absolute chaos of the moment swirl around me without moving a single muscle. The pain in my spine was a dull, rhythmic throb, a constant reminder of the price I had paid to stand in this exact room. I slowly raised my left arm, pulling back the cuff of my heavy winter coat to look at my wristwatch. I noted the time with clinical precision. "You didn't think I just froze the accounts, did you?" I asked, my voice carrying clearly over the wailing sirens outside. Trent stared at me, his mouth open, his breathing ragged and shallow. Reginald gripped his hair, pressing his back against the desk as if trying to merge with the wood. "Freezing the accounts was simply a corporate formality to protect my firm's investments," I stated, dropping my arm back to my side and locking eyes with the man who had defrauded my family. "I forwarded the complete unredacted ledger of your Cayman Island wire fraud, your forged power of attorney documents, and the deed to your secret Sandy Springs property directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation an hour ago." Trent let out a strangled, breathless gasp. His knees gave out and he collapsed onto the floor, staring at me as if I were the devil himself. "They have been waiting at the end of the street for my signal," I said, my tone deadly calm. "I wanted to make sure you were all gathered together in one place. I wanted to make sure you understood exactly why your empire was ending before they took it all away." Through the massive windows, the scene outside rapidly escalated into full tactical execution. The flashing red and blue lights were suddenly joined by the harsh, blinding beams of heavy flashlights cutting through the darkness of the estate gardens. Men and women wearing dark tactical windbreakers with the bright, unmistakable yellow letters FBI emblazoned across their backs swarmed into the backyard. They moved with absolute terrifying precision, securing the perimeter, blocking every gate, and marching directly toward the patio doors. The jazz band was gone. The elite socialites were gone. The carefully constructed illusion of the Sterling family's wealth and prestige had been completely incinerated. All that remained was the flashing red and blue lights, the wailing sirens, and the federal agents closing in to drag them all out into the cold, harsh reality of federal prison. The heavy, reinforced doors of the Buckhead mansion swung open as a half-dozen federal agents poured into the grand hallway. Their heavy tactical boots thundered against the polished hardwood floors, completely obliterating the last traces of the elegant summer kickoff gala. The flashing red and blue lights from the cruisers parked on the circular driveway spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the opulent walls in frantic, strobing colors. They bypassed the terrified catering staff and moved with ruthless, calculated precision directly toward the patio. Trent was still pinned against the marble by my private security operatives. His manicured hands were wrenched behind his back, his face pressed hard against the cold stone. When he saw the bright yellow letters spelling FBI on the windbreakers of the advancing agents, the last remaining shred of his arrogant tech visionary persona completely evaporated. He began to thrash wildly, his expensive leather shoes scraping uselessly against the patio. "You have the wrong man!" Trent screamed, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic pitch. "I am a victim here. My father-in-law is the CEO. Reginald Sterling is the one you want. I am just a consultant. I do not have signatory authority on those accounts." The lead federal agent did not even blink. He stepped forward, signaling to my private security detail to step back. The agent hauled Trent up by the collar of his ruined linen suit, slamming him against the stone pillar of the patio to secure the federal handcuffs around his wrists. The metallic click echoed sharply through the humid night air, a definitive, inescapable sound of absolute ruin. "You are Trent Harrison," the agent stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and the interstate transportation of stolen property. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it." Trent was hyperventilating, his eyes wide and rolling with sheer panic. He realized instantly that throwing Reginald under the bus was not going to save him. The federal government had the unredacted ledgers. They had the offshore routing numbers. They had the absolute undeniable proof of his Cayman Island accounts. He was completely cornered, and the reality of a federal prison sentence was crashing down on him. He desperately whipped his head around, searching the patio for a lifeline. His eyes locked onto his wife. Jasmine was still sitting on the flagstone, her custom silk dress stained with spilled champagne. The thick red folder rested on her lap. Her hands were trembling violently as she clutched the high-definition surveillance photograph of Trent lifting a toddler onto his shoulders in the driveway of a secret home in Sandy Springs. Her golden child reality had been entirely incinerated. She was staring at the image of the second family her husband had funded with her stolen inheritance, completely paralyzed by the sheer, unfathomable magnitude of his betrayal. Jasmine Trent begged, his voice rising in hysterical desperation as the agents began to drag him toward the French doors. "Jasmine, baby, you have to help me. Call the lawyers. Call the trust managers. You have to bail me out. Please, Jasmine. Tell them it is a mistake. Tell them I had your authorization to use the funds." Jasmine slowly lifted her head. Her eyes, usually so bright with entitlement and superiority, were completely hollow. She looked at the man she had flaunted in front of our family, the man she had claimed was building a world-changing legacy. She looked at his tear-streaked, cowardly face, illuminated by the flashing lights of the police cruisers. She did not stand up. She did not scream for the agents to stop. She simply held up the photograph of his secret dark-haired mistress, holding a newborn baby. "I hope you rot in a cage, Trent." Jasmine whispered, her voice, devoid of tears, replaced by a cold, vacant horror. "I hope you die in there." Trent opened his mouth to scream another pathetic excuse, but the federal agents aggressively shoved him forward, marching him through the ballroom and out the front doors of the estate. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them, cutting off his frantic, pleading voice. Outside, the engines of the police cruisers roared to life. The sirens wailed briefly as the convoy pulled away from the gates, carrying the fraudulent tech genius away into the darkness. The flashing lights faded from the walls of the mansion. The suffocating, heavy silence returned to the estate. Jasmine remained on the lawn, weeping silently, her entire life completely and utterly destroyed. Vivian was still crumpled on the floor of the home office, clutching her chest and rocking back and forth as the reality of their social and financial execution settled over her. I stood in the center of the shattered office, letting the absolute quiet wash over me. The dull, persistent ache in my fused spine was entirely eclipsed by the massive, untouchable power I now held over the people who had tried to discard me. I watched my father. Reginald Sterling was still on his knees behind his massive mahogany desk. He had just watched his son-in-law get dragged away in federal handcuffs. He had just listened to the managing director of Vanguard Financial confirm that his corporate empire was being actively seized. He was completely cornered, stripped of his wealth, his prestige, and his power. But the survival instinct of a true narcissist is a remarkably resilient thing. Reginald took a deep, shuddering breath. He placed his hands flat against the top of the desk and slowly pushed himself up from the floor. He leaned heavily against the wood, his chest heaving, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. He looked around the ruined office, his eyes darting from the splintered doors to Vivian weeping on the rug and finally back to me. He reached up with trembling hands and straightened the collar of his expensive dress shirt. He adjusted his silk tie. He rolled his shoulders back desperately, trying to physically reconstruct the arrogant, untouchable patriarch he had been just an hour ago. He needed to find a lifeline. He needed to find a single shred of leverage to convince himself that he was not entirely defeated. His eyes swept over the mahogany walls, the built-in bookshelves, and the sprawling square footage of the Buckhead mansion. A dark, defiant glint slowly returned to his gaze. "You think you have won?" Reginald said, his voice raspy but gaining a desperate, forced strength. "You think you can just march into my house and completely dismantle my life because you hold a corporate note?" He took a step away from the desk, standing taller, trying to look down at me with his signature brand of condescending authority. Trent was a fool, Reginald spat, completely severing his loyalty to the man he had championed just yesterday. He was a thief, and he deserves whatever the federal government does to him. And yes, you may have triggered a default on the logistics firm. You may have the institutional backing of Vanguard to seize the corporate assets. You took my company, and you destroyed my son-in-law. Reginald spread his arms wide, gesturing to the opulent, expansive architecture of the room around us. "But you cannot take my home," he declared, his voice ringing with a desperate, triumphant arrogance. "This estate is in my name, Iman. It is my primary residence. It is completely insulated by a localized corporate veil. It has absolutely nothing to do with the mezzanine debt of Sterling Logistics. You can freeze the freight accounts, you can seize the warehouses, but you cannot touch this property. This is my sanctuary, and you will be leaving it immediately." He pointed a stiff finger toward the shattered doorway, trying to issue a command he had absolutely no power to enforce. I looked at my father. I looked at the man who had confidently signed a do not resuscitate order while I was fighting for my life in a hospital bed simply to preserve the wealth he erroneously believed he still possessed. His delusion was breathtaking. He truly believed that his personal fortress was impenetrable. He believed that the rules of high-level finance simply did not apply to him because of his name and his zip code. I did not raise my voice. I did not move toward the door. I simply stood my ground, my posture perfectly rigid, supported by the titanium rods in my spine and the absolute certainty of my execution strategy. I reached into the sleek black leather of my designer bag resting on the side table. My fingers brushed past my hospital discharge papers and found the crisp, heavy stock of a legal document. I pulled it out. It was a single pristine sheet of paper, stamped with a heavy, embossed notary seal. "Reginald," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, clinical register that chilled the air in the room. "When Sterling Logistics was bleeding cash 3 years ago, when the supply chain failed and traditional banks refused to extend your line of credit, you were absolutely desperate. You needed a massive, immediate injection of capital just to keep the lights on and the trucks moving." Reginald lowered his arm, his eyes locking onto the document in my hand. The desperate bravado began to slip from his face, replaced by a creeping cold dread. "Private equity firms do not offer mezzanine debt to failing logistics companies. Out of the goodness of their hearts," I explained, stepping slowly toward the desk. "We require absolute, undeniable leverage." "But you were so arrogant. You were so convinced that your business would bounce back, that you were entirely untouchable, that you did not even bother having your legal team review the addendums of the proxy fund buyout. You just wanted the cash." I held the document up, letting the ambient light catch the embossed gold seal at the bottom of the page. "About that," I said, my tone lethal and utterly devoid of pity, "you really should read what you sign." I dropped the heavy notarized document directly onto the center of the polished mahogany desk. The thick paper landed with a soft, definitive thud right on top of the leather-bound ledger where Reginald had spent decades tracking the wealth he no longer possessed. "Read the third paragraph on the second page," I instructed, my voice entirely stripped of emotion. "Read the clause you blindly initialed, because you were in such a desperate rush to secure the Vanguard capital injection before your country club peers found out your logistics empire was bleeding cash." Reginald stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. His hands shook violently. He slowly reached out, his manicured fingers trembling so hard they could barely grip the edge of the document. He pulled it toward him, his bloodshot eyes scanning the dense, perfectly formatted legal text. Vivian remained on her knees on the Persian rug, her chest heaving with ragged, panicked breaths. "Reginald, what is it?" she demanded, her voice shrill and entirely devoid of its usual aristocratic polish. "Tell me what she is talking about. Tell me we are safe." Reginald did not answer her. He could not. His eyes were locked on a specific paragraph, tracking the words back and forth as his brain violently rejected the reality of what he was reading. His jaw dropped open. A strange, choked wheeze escaped his throat. "You bypassed your in-house legal counsel when you signed this agreement," I explained, stepping slowly around the edge of the desk, dominating the space. "You assumed the Vanguard proxy fund was just another standard commercial bailout. You assumed your reputation alone was enough collateral. But private equity firms do not issue mezzanine debt to failing, mismanaged logistics companies out of the goodness of their hearts. We require absolute, undeniable leverage." I stopped beside his chair, looking down at the document. "The underwriting required a personal guarantee," I stated, enunciating each word with lethal surgical precision. a secondary layer of collateral to mitigate the extreme risk of your incompetence. By signing that addendum, you explicitly agreed to cross-collateralize your corporate debt with your personal real estate portfolio. You pledged the Buckhead estate against the corporate loans. Vivian let out a sharp, horrified gasp. She scrambled up from the floor, her ruined floral gown tangling around her legs. "No!" she shrieked, launching herself toward the desk and grabbing Reginald by the shoulder. "Tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not gamble our home. This is my house." Reginald slowly looked up at his wife, his face entirely hollowed out, resembling a corpse. "I did not think it mattered," he whispered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, broken rasp. "The interest rates were low. I thought Trent was going to triple the operating revenue. I thought the house was just a formality. Since I am the sole proprietor of the proxy fund that absorbed your debt," I continued, my voice cutting cleanly through Vivian's rising hysteria, "and since you unequivocally defaulted on the covenants this morning by attempting to wire $500,000 to a fraudulent offshore account, the automatic asset seizure protocols were executed immediately." I leaned down, placing my hands flat on the desk, bringing my face inches from Reginald's terrified eyes. "I do not just own your fleet of trucks, Reginald. I hold the primary deed to this property. The localized corporate veil you thought was protecting you was completely dissolved the moment you missed your vendor payments. You are standing in my home office. You are trespassing on my property." At that exact moment, the heavy, shattered doors of the office were pushed open. Jasmine staggered into the room. The golden child was completely unrecognizable. She was shivering violently, her custom silk dress clinging to her body. Her face was a nightmare of running mascara and smeared makeup. She was still clutching the red folder, her knuckles white as she gripped the surveillance photographs of Trent kissing his hidden mistress. She had watched the federal agents drag her husband out of the house in handcuffs. She had watched the flashing red and blue lights carry her entire future away into the dark. She looked from Reginald to Vivian, and finally her dead, vacant eyes landed on me. "He is gone," Jasmine whispered, her voice devoid of any tone or inflection. "The FBI took him. They took the cars. They took his computer. He was crying. He was begging them. He is facing 30 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud," I stated coldly, not taking my eyes off my father. "And he will take every single one of you down with him if you try to intervene." Jasmine slowly slumped against the doorframe, sliding down the wood until she hit the floor. The golden child, the sister who had spent her entire life mocking my career, stealing my inheritance, and treating me like a disposable servant, was now a penniless, abandoned shell sitting in the wreckage of her own arrogance. Vivian turned to me, her face contorted with a desperate feral rage. "You planned this!" she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "You orchestrated all of this to destroy us. You set us up. We will sue you. We will take this to the Supreme Court. We will have you disbarred and thrown in prison." "You have absolutely nothing to sue me with, Vivian," I replied, my voice completely tranquil. "Your accounts are frozen. Your credit cards will decline. Your country club memberships are already suspended. You do not have the liquid capital to hire a paralegal, let alone a federal litigation team. You are completely, utterly bankrupt." I stood up straight, rolling my shoulders back. The dull heat in my fused spine was a grounding, powerful reminder of exactly why I was standing here. I looked at the three of them. Reginald paralyzed in his chair, Vivian shaking with impotent rage, Jasmine staring blankly at the wall. They were the monsters of my childhood, the architects of my suffering, and they had completely dismantled themselves. I reached up and touched the white medical tape covering the fresh surgical scar on my neck. I pressed my fingers against the wound, feeling the steady, rhythmic pulse of my own heartbeat. "Let us talk about family loyalty," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, haunting whisper that commanded the absolute silence of the room. "Let us talk about the exact timeline of your greed." Reginald squeezed his eyes shut, anticipating the blow. "When the trauma surgeon walked into the waiting room and told you that my spine was shattering, I continued, my gaze locking onto my father. When they told you that without an immediate $250,000 surgery, the swelling would reach my brainstem and stop my lungs, you did not hesitate. You looked at the doctor, You looked at your bank accounts and you made a calculation. I stepped slowly around the desk, stopping directly in front of him. You gave the doctor exactly 48 hours. I said, the words echoing like a gavel striking wood. You gave the hospital a strict 48-hour deadline to unplug my life support because keeping your eldest daughter breathing was deemed a bad investment. You put an expiration date on my life so you could fund a white con artist. Vivian let out a soft, horrified whimper, finally realizing the absolute magnitude of their moral failure. Jasmine squeezed her eyes shut, pulling her knees to her chest. I looked at my watch, noting the exact position of the hands. I tapped the glass face with my index finger. I am a professional, Reginald. I stated, my tone entirely devoid of mercy. I honor timelines. I honor the parameters established by the prevailing party. I pointed my finger directly at the shattered office door. I am giving you exactly 48 hours to pack your bags and get out of my house. I commanded the absolute authority of the statement, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. You may take your personal clothing. You may take your personal toiletries. Every piece of furniture, every piece of art, every vehicle in the garage, and every single asset on this property belongs to Vanguard Financial. Reginald opened his mouth to protest, a weak, pathetic sound escaping his throat. 48 hours, I repeated, raising my voice to drown out his excuses. If you are still on this property when the clock expires, I will have the Fulton County Sheriff's Department drag you out onto the street for criminal trespassing. I turned away from my father and looked at the security operative standing in the hallway. Escort my tenants out of the office, I instructed, and ensure they do not attempt to remove any corporate assets from the premises. The operative nodded sharply, stepping into the room. I did not look back. I simply walked past my weeping mother, past my shattered sister, and out into the grand hallway of the estate I now owned. The 48-hour countdown expired on a Tuesday morning. The air was thick with a humid, suffocating heat as the reality of their destruction finally set in. I stood on the grand balcony overlooking the front gates, watching the brutal, unglamorous execution of their eviction. There were no moving trucks, no professional relocation teams. Reginald and Vivian could not afford to hire anyone. They were forced to carry their belongings in cheap plastic garbage bags and a few battered suitcases they had scavenged from the attic. Reginald looked like a walking corpse. He was wearing wrinkled sweatpants and a faded polo shirt, his shoulders slumped, his face completely gray. He dragged a heavy trash bag down the marble front steps, his hands shaking. Vivian followed him, wearing dark sunglasses to hide her swollen, tear-stained face, clutching a single designer handbag she had managed to smuggle out. Jasmine walked behind them in total silence, her head bowed, carrying a cardboard box filled with her clothes. They loaded their pathetic belongings into a rusty 15-year-old sedan that Vivian's cousin had reluctantly loaned them. The luxury vehicles they had flaunted for years were already locked in the estate garage, legally seized and scheduled for federal auction. I watched the rusty sedan sputter to life, kicking up a cloud of dark exhaust as it slowly rolled down the manicured driveway. The heavy iron gates of the Buckhead estate swung open, releasing them onto the street, and then firmly slammed shut behind them, locking them out of the kingdom they had stolen from me. Their new reality was a brutal, unforgiving shock to their carefully curated nervous systems. They were forced to move into a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a decaying low-income complex on the outskirts of the city. The contrast was physically devastating. The walls were paper-thin, the linoleum floors were peeling, and the constant abrasive hum of failing fluorescent lights replaced the classical music that used to echo through the mansion. Reginald attempted to secure a loan to start over, walking into corporate banks with his chest puffed out, demanding to speak with the executives he used to golf with. He was systematically laughed out of every single lobby. His name was radioactive. He was a blacklisted pariah, tied to a massive federal wire fraud investigation. No one would even validate his parking. Vivian's psychological breakdown was absolute. She spent her days sitting on a stained thrift store sofa, desperately dialing the numbers of her elite socialite friends. Every single call went directly to voicemail. The women who used to drink champagne on her patio had entirely erased her from their social registers. She was no longer a queen. She was a cautionary tale. Jasmine was forced to face the ultimate indignity. Stripped of her golden child status, her trust fund entirely vaporized, she had to apply for a minimum wage job at a local retail store just to keep the electricity turned on in the apartment. Trent was sitting in a federal holding cell denied bail due to his status as a severe flight risk. He wore an orange jumpsuit, spending his days pacing a concrete room, waiting for a trial that would inevitably result in decades of federal prison time. Jasmine refused to accept his collect calls. The desperation eventually broke their pride. The voicemails began arriving on my phone 3 weeks after the eviction. Iman, please, Vivian's voice would echo through the speaker, trembling and weak. The hot water has been shut off. Reginald cannot find work. Jasmine's paycheck is not enough to cover the rent. We just need $5,000. Just a tiny monthly allowance. You have so much. Please, Iman. We are starving. I listened to the voicemail while sitting at my desk sipping a cup of hot black coffee. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel a shred of guilt. I simply pressed the red button on my screen, permanently blocking their numbers from my network. They were ghosts completely banished to the purgatory they had built with their own hands. 6 months later, the physical and emotional scars had completely healed. The dull, throbbing pain in my spine was entirely gone, replaced by a solid, unyielding strength. The titanium rods in my back felt less like medical hardware and more like a permanent, unbreakable armor. I stood taller, breathing easier, entirely free of the suffocating weight of my family's toxic expectations. The Buckhead estate had undergone a massive structural transformation. The suffocating patriarchal oil paintings of Reginald Sterling had been stripped from the walls and burned. The dark, imposing mahogany furniture had been hauled away. In its place, the mansion was flooded with natural light, filled with sleek, modern workspaces and vibrant, powerful art. I had transformed the lavish family estate into the official headquarters and primary retreat center for a new, highly aggressive philanthropic foundation. The grand ballroom where Vivian used to host her hollow, superficial galas was now a high-tech conference center. The sprawling gardens were utilized for intensive networking retreats. I had built a sovereign financial institution dedicated entirely to funding, educating, and rigorously mentoring young, ambitious Black women in the fields of high-level finance and technology. I was teaching them how to read the fine print. I was teaching them how to leverage corporate debt. I was giving them the exact tools and capital they needed to ensure they would never, under any circumstances, be dependent on men like Reginald or Trent. I was building an army of brilliant, ruthless women who knew exactly how to secure their own power. I stood on the grand balcony of the master suite, the crisp morning air washing over my face. I rested my hands on the cool stone railing, looking out over the manicured lawns and the busy, brilliant young women walking through the gardens below. The empire was entirely mine. I had not just survived the coma. I had not just survived the betrayal. I had completely conquered the people who had tried to bury me. I had taken their kingdom, dismantled their legacy, and rebuilt it into a fortress of absolute independence. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the vibrant, pulsing energy of a life entirely under my own control. The ultimate devastating revenge was not just taking their money. It was living a beautiful, powerful life, exactly where they used to stand. The profound lesson from this story is that true security and self-worth can never be derived from toxic environments or conditional love, even from blood relatives. Iman's journey illustrates the power of silent strategic resilience. When faced with systematic devaluation and ultimate betrayal, she did not react with immediate emotional outbursts. Instead, she methodically built her own empire, ensuring her financial and professional independence. It teaches us that we cannot change the destructive nature of narcissistic abusers, but we can completely remove their power over our lives. True vindication comes from claiming your autonomy and protecting your own future. If you found this story of empowerment and sweet revenge inspiring, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts and subscribe for more thrilling narratives.